Hey guys, you are watching your anime world. How are you all? Please support to subscribe this channel for watching new interesting stories. So in this video, we will see second part, what if Deku was born with a cursed blood quirk. Here is short summary. Izuku was born with a quirk, just not the kind of quirk he wanted, or the kind that was liked by those around him. Now he has to find his place among the heroes, with a curse that seems fit for the darkest villain. But before we start, if you want more stuff like this, then be sure to subscribe and like this video. And if possible, share this video with your friends. Now let's start the story. Tsuyu was dreaming. There could be no other possible explanation. Why else would she be laughing so openly when normally she'd keep her emotions more in check? Why else would she be indulging in something so childish as happily jumping up and down in place, flailing her arms around in complete glee? Her surroundings screamed pleasant childish dream as well, from the emerald sun bathing the world in its viridescent light to the dark green and fluffy grass that carpeted the ground to the horizon. Silliest of all was what the frog girl found herself laying on. Kiro. Tsuyu laughed some more, like there was no tomorrow. She was finally free of her own self-consciousness, that iron certainty her amphibian features were undesirable. Instead, she was suffused in the same elation that had come when someone had told her that her laughter was cute. Looking down, Tsuyu laughed again at the giant buttercream icing-soaked cinnamon roll she was laying atop of. The confection was so large and comfortable she could have used it as a bed, a sweet bed so fragrant it felt like her nose would be able to find it anywhere on the planet. The warmth coming from the baked goods was also so warm that as long as the frog girl touched it, she knew no winter would be able to force her into hibernation. Of course this was a dream, and a silly one at that. Tsuyu would have expected one of her siblings to have enjoyed such a fantasy, but she was surprised how happy it was making her. I don't know how, but I'm going to eat you whole. Kiro. The frog girl declared and then laughed as she buried her face into the spongy pastry. Then she had a thought. With a mischievous smile adorning her face, Tsuyu decided on marking this glorious find for herself in such a way that not even her siblings at their brattiest could make her share it. She licked it, slowly and sloppily. Su-chan. The voice of her savior resounded in the frog girl's ears, causing her to blink back to reality in surprise. The silly dream world disappeared, the emerald sun morphing into Izuku's blushing face. Tsuyu's giant, delicious cinnamon roll transformed as well, becoming the green-haired teen's bare chest, which she was still licking. Kiro. The startled croak burst from Tsuyu's throat as soon as she realized where she was and what she was doing. Trembling in mortification, she retracted her tongue. Despite her naturally lowered capacity to perceive taste, the frog girl could unequivocally claim to have a good and permanent impression of the flavor of the boy she'd been using as a bed. That thought, followed by the realization that her actions no doubt appeared incredibly lewd, caused Tsuyu to begin blushing heavily. What could Izuku possibly think of her now? Why did you? Izuku couldn't get his mind together enough to even ask the question that was begging to be answered. His mind couldn't form a plausible explanation for his new friend's behavior. Granted, she'd been moving around for a while now, and had cuddled up to him pretty much the entire night, but he'd assumed it was due to her nature. Since the frog girl was most likely cold-blooded, having a warm body next to her would have definitely been too much for her instincts to resist. Tsuyu buried her face into her savior's chest in a futile attempt to hide her embarrassment. Trying to kickstart her brain, the frog girl tried to think of something she could say, anything really, that could salvage the situation. It was a dream, Kiro, Tsuyu said before she could stop herself. The ambiguous statement hadn't been the best response possible, in the frog girl's opinion, but it was too late now. What if the green-haired teen assumed she'd been dreaming about him? Instead of jumping to accusations like she thought he would, Izuku only hugged Tsuyu closer. I'm going to take a leap of faith here and assume you were dreaming about food. The green-haired teen's one-armed hug, due to Tae still being glued to his left side the entire night even though she didn't need sleep, made the frog girl feel much better. This could work for her. Tsuyu limited her response to a wordless nod into her savior's chest, avoiding eye contact at all costs. The convenient half-truth was enough for her to get a handle on her embarrassment, but she wasn't going to take any chances that might damage the two's new friendship. "Ah, well, that explains it," Izuku consoled the girl in his lap. "You haven't had food since yesterday. Your stomach no doubt finished healing overnight and you must be starving now. Tae, bring me the case please." Izuku's sudden order caught Tsuyu off guard, but not as much as when the green-haired teen began to raise the bed to reach a sitting position. "Hero." The frog girl's croak, in all tones and forms, was becoming one of Izuku's favorite sounds. However, remembering what had happened last time he tried to praise his classmate's cuteness, he refrained from commenting this time out of fear of creeping her out. Following her master's command, Tae carried over a small case from the other side of the room. It was the same case Izuku had carried his cigar-shaped candies in. "I know we should really wait for Recovery Girl's approval," Izuku said as Tae placed the case in his waiting hand, "but I think a bit of sugar will do wonders for your hunger right now." Popping open the metal container, sure enough, the green-haired teen picked out a candied cigar. With a smile, Izuku handed the faux cancer stick to his bedmate. As Tsuyu began to beep and lick at the piece of candy, she finally felt her stomach beginning to work again. And just as Izuku had said, the frog girl found herself incredibly hungry. Unfortunately for her, for all that it was tasty, the candy didn't match up to the cinnamon roll she'd dreamed about. The green-haired teen continued to smile as his friend chewed down on the candy he'd given her, gently patting her head due to how cute she looked doing so. Her adorableness was off the charts, and he could barely restrain himself from hugging the girl in his lap. It was a scene of pure diabetes-level sweetness, a scene suddenly broken by a curt-sounding cough. "Didn't you two promise not to get carried away with the mood?" Recovery Girl asked, standing at the door with her arms crossed. Seeing that the two teens in the bed appeared confused by her observation, the nurse continued. "I could have turned a blind eye to walking in on you spooning like old lovers. But this youthful lotus position." The stern descriptor was enough for the teens to finally look down and notice how they'd been positioned. Somehow, Tsuyu had ended up straddling Izuku, happily leaning on his bare chest. Her hospital gown, nowhere in sight, had been lost overnight due to not being tied to leave her back exposed. The end result, the frog girl was left in only her sports bra and the lower half of her costume, tattered as it was. Coupled with Izuku's own bare torso, the image presented left for quite the lascivious impression. Faces simultaneously caught fire as both teens locked eyes. The green duo suddenly noticed how their bodies were beginning to respond to more hormonal impulses, and fervently wished no one else would enter the room. Until they had an opportunity to separate and dress, explaining their position would be incredibly difficult without becoming even more mortified. Then, as if called by the teens' desperate wishes, two more women entered the nurse's office without any warning. "Izuku-kun, I brought you breakfast," Inko happily announced as she entered the room along with her new best friend Beru. Taking in the scene they'd walked into, the homely mother could hardly express her surprise. "Oh my." The fact the Midoriya matriarch said this with a smile was lost on the two red-faced teens. "Hero." Beru's reaction wasn't much different from her fellow mothers. The frog woman almost sounded delighted by what she was seeing. "This isn't what it looks like. Hero." Tsuyu quickly cut in, trying to defuse the situation as she perceived it. The last thing the frog girl wanted was for her mother to suddenly hate her savior. Or for the green-haired teen's mother to think she was some wickedly perverted girl. Izuku watched, absolutely confused, as both mothers winked at each other while accepting Tsuyu's frantic words with matching smiles. The frog girl's word vomit was only ended when Recovery Girl returned and announced it was time for the final scan to be made. The elderly heroine repeatedly mentioned how it wasn't necessary for them to change positions. The examination lasted several minutes, as Recovery Girl checked in every way conceivable to make sure the regeneration had been a success. In the end, the elderly heroine found no worrisome signs, and gave the teens the green light to begin separating. Oddly enough, this proved to be a bit more difficult than first believed, as Tsuyu found it hard to work up the nerve to let go of Izuku's hand, for fearing of suddenly dying. Meanwhile, Katsuki Bakugo sat on his bed, unable to take his eyes off the oversized bracers he was wearing. He knew about this kind of hardware and what it was used for. The police would be immediately notified if he even attempted to use his quirk. The shackles were famous for usually being worn by criminals going through rehabilitation, or those awaiting trial. The blonde wasn't an idiot, he knew what kind of trouble he'd landed in. Still, the fault rested entirely at the feet of his arch-nemesis. That the damnable coward had purposefully positioned himself so others would be hurt by his justified attack. The explosive teen had a problem though. This wasn't just a matter of settling a score with the only piece of shit he'd never been able to break into submission anymore. This time, his entire family was being involved, and for once, things weren't bending to his favor as they usually did. Beeping Romero, "This is your entire fault," Bakugo muttered, his mind tying itself into knots as it tried in vain to twist the events to his benefit. There was no way he'd beeped up, no way he'd have to plead for mercy to keep his family from being destroyed, no way his dream was on the line. Downstairs from the smoldering teen, Mitsuki was on the verge of breaking down, the parting words from her now ex-best friend reverberating in her ears. The homely woman had every right to be enraged though, she knew. There was no denying her son had tried to murder Izuku, almost succeeding in killing an innocent bystander in the attempt. The other words that haunted the Ashen Mother were those of Beru Asui, her son's other victim's mother. "I'll see you in court." The frog woman's words were both searing iron and icy water, leaving Mitsuki with hot and cold spikes as she thought on the dismal prospects of her family's future. Even the woman's scant dreams offered no comforts. She'd seen nothing but visions of her son spending the rest of his days jailed, her husband working double shifts at a fast food joint after losing his job due to the scandal, and herself being forced into prostitution just to pay fines and the medical bills of her son's victims. And all of this had come about because for all her trying, she'd somehow failed to drill into her son's thick head that power required responsibility. "At least, there's still one chance," Mitsuki muttered to herself as she remembered Nezu's parting's words. "Little as it is." The principal had told her that he'd wait for the resolution of her son's trial, if there was one, before making his final decision. It was possible for Katsuki to walk away from this without jail time, heavily restricted sure, but still free. That was, if the Asui and Iida families felt merciful. Local drive-in Tori, lunchtime. The cheap fast food place the group of 3+ zombie found themselves at hadn't been Beru's first choice in her effort to repay the Midoriya family, but the verdant mother and son pair had insisted on a place that was inexpensive and plentiful. The small but lively establishment the frog woman had eventually chosen was the closest business that fit such a description for their celebration. And did they have something to celebrate about? The regeneration had been a complete success and the test separation had worked out just fine. Suyu was now completely free to move around on her own and return to her normal life. For his part, Izuku had been unable to hide his extreme happiness since the all-clear had been given. It was time to eat to their heart's content. "Ah!" Tei's happy groan was only slightly muffled by drool as the zombie girl reached for a large piece of raw chicken, intentions to stuff her mouth full with the meat clear to all. Acting almost as if it were second nature, Izuku lightly slapped the undead's hand away. "No, you wait until it's well cooked, then you eat," the green-haired teen said, effortlessly popping an already prepared chunk of meat into Tei's open mouth. The resulting scene of the zombie girl happily chewing away was rather cute, all things considered. Beru found herself more and more fascinated by the boy every moment she spent in his presence. From the hidden potentials of his quirk to his truly noble disposition, he was a wonder. The frog woman knew he was technically a mutant type, and one with abilities that came with concerning side effects to be sure, but Izuku had so far shown such a strong heart that it was impossible not to see the budding hero within him. The Asui matriarch was fully aware of the harsh realities of the world though, and how people were quick to label others based on the power or appearance of their quirks and leave it at that. Mutants, for one reason or another depending on whom you asked, were always ranked lowest in the hierarchy, lower still if the individuality in question was classified as dark in nature. Which was completely arbitrary trash in her opinion. Even so, there was no doubt in the frog woman's mind that the green-haired teen sitting across from her must have endured a certain kind of hell for much of his life. Being not only a mutant, but a mutant regenerator at that, already placed him amongst the weakest of classifications, but the additional capability to raise and control the dead dragged him into the dark side of the spectrum as well. The stigma against every step he'd ever taken must have been outrageous. And she would know. Beru prided herself in the fact that a large portion of her law firm's casework was in the pursuit of justice for those unfairly affected by society's bias against those born with weaker quirks. It disgusted her that there was a tendency or even willingness to overlook the faults of the strong and flashy, just because of what they could do, or the fame they might garner. What worried the Asui matriarch the most, however, was how Izuku Midoriya's situation would be changing soon. With the miraculous success that was her daughter's recovery, those who became interested in the cute cinnamon roll and his quirk would easily overlook his original placement in order to sink their claws into him. These days, everyone wanted a healing quirk in the family, no matter what. Which led her thoughts to the worst cases Beru had ever had to handle over the years, those regarding the as of yet unbanned practice of quirk breeding. The number of times a family or individual had pushed their quirkist ideals beyond acceptability had become disconcerting lately. And if those same parties knew of a quirk that could not only heal the user, but others as well. So, she needs to eat. Hero, Beru eventually asked, shaking herself from her dismal thoughts as she eyed the zombie girl. Unconcerned with the light scrutiny, Tae blissfully chewed away on her piece of chicken. She appeared to the unknowledgeable observer to be completely unconcerned about, even unaware of, the world around her. Not really, Izuku replied, continuing to cook pieces of chicken at their table. But letting her chew on things seems to help quell her need to bite. Also, it seems kind of cruel to eat in front of her without letting her have some. The green-haired teen's considerate words came on the heels of his ongoing effort to keep Suyu's plate well supplied. In focusing on such a task, however, the hero in training had been completely missing the grins adorning the faces of the watching mother over the meal. So, it's more like she wants to eat, but doesn't have to? Suyu asked, mostly as a cover so she could have more time to wonder why she was enjoying the attention of her savior so much. Unlike the apparently oblivious green-haired teen, the frog girl had noticed the smiles their mothers kept sharing. Her observational talent had been turned against her, however, as now she feared for an incredibly awkward moment that had to be brewing for the future. That's what I figure, Izuku answered after swallowing his own bite of food. It's a human instinct after all. Yesterday, you weren't able to stomach food, but that didn't stop you from wanting to eat something. By that logic, Tae probably has a desire to eat something every now and then. Suyu blushed at the reminder of an embarrassing moment from early on in the hospital bed, when she'd unthinkingly asked for a snack only to be immediately reminded by Recovery Girl that her stomach still had a gaping hole in it. Sorry for making you all wait, Inko called out as she took her place at the group's table, returning the party to 4+ Zombie. The staff was insistent that I sign a responsibility waiver to keep Tae inside. I don't understand why they're all so on edge around her though. She's never attacked anyone unprovoked before. Beru waved off her fellow mother's apology, instead silently gesturing with her eyes for Inko to take a look at their children. Both teens had somehow become trapped in a constant state of catching the other's eye, blushing, and then looking away, only to repeat the process. It was adorable. Don't worry about it, Inko-chan. Hero, Beru welcomed the homely mother once she'd taken her fill of the scene. I should be the one apologizing. My husband very much wanted to personally thank your son as well, but couldn't get away today. The firm just had a large influx of new cases come in at the same time a number of our current ones were concluded, so as the chief legal accountant he's tied up getting everything sorted out. The Asui matriarch felt even more at ease with the Midoriya woman at that moment than she had the day before, both having kept in touch during their children's recoveries. As mothers, their worrying had kept them from sleeping, and having someone who knew exactly how they felt was a great relief. They'd chatted a little about everything, even getting into some incredibly personal matters. It had come as a surprise to Beru to discover that her new friend had become a widow only 5 years ago, though her husband had been away from the family's home due to work for much longer. Official documents showed that Hisashi Midoriya's death had been caused by a work-related accident, completely at the employer's fault. A generous life insurance policy, coupled with compensation provided by the company, had been enough for Inko to sustain a comfortable life as a lower-middle-class single mother. The real story, however, had turned out to be much more scandalous. Inko had been hesitant to share at first, but half a decade of bottled-up words and emotions had eventually come pouring out in the face of Beru's calm and understanding mannerisms. The homely woman had spoken of an affair with a younger woman, a murder, fake divorce and marriage certificates, and even an attempt to abscond with both the insurance money and compensation. It had been a wild tale to be sure, and one that Izuku was better off not knowing. The poor child's life was already hard enough without the extra burden of the truth of his father's fate weighing on his shoulders. "I think it's kind of better this way, no offense," Izuku shouted, hands waving crazily as soon as he realized how his words could be taken. "I mean, I want to meet your husband too, ma'am, but I don't know what I could say to him. You've already forgiven me for when I had to touch Su-chan, but would he feel the same?" As the green-haired teen voiced his thoughts and fears, the kindness and understanding in the Asui matriarch's round eyes were a reassuring sight to see. Still, even though Suyu's mother seemed to be just like his own in being empathetic and accepting, he'd never really had a father figure present enough to be able to guess how one would react. The hero in training truly believed he had no guarantee of survival if he encountered the man. "He would have loved to meet you, hero," Suyu replied with honesty. There was little doubt in her mind of this fact, even though she'd only had less than a day to really tell her parents about her classmate and savior. The frog girl knew very well her mother and father dreamed of finding her a suitor like Izuku, one that was not only noble, but responsible, easygoing, hard-working, and depended more on his brains than brawn. Quietly, she also knew they'd often despaired at the prospect of ever finding such a person. But now, indeed he would have, hero, Beru agreed. Suddenly, the frog woman turned to Inko, a serious look stealing over her normally stoic face. "That reminds me, Inko-chan. I would like to make you a proposition." Suyu froze on the spot. She'd known her mother would bring up the idea at some point, but to cut straight to talk of an arranged marriage after only a day. The frog girl had known one would most likely be in her future if she wanted a family anyway, but she really didn't want to force her new best friend and savior into a situation like this so soon. Especially not right now. "Su-chan, are you all right?" Izuku asked when he noticed how Suyu had stiffened and paled out of the blue. In response, the frog girl only blushed, unable to help herself in the face of such caring shown by her savior. He spoke, and it was like honey flowed from his lips. "You see, I have 2 other children, a real pair of little devils," Beru began, laying out the groundwork for her plan. The frog woman knew the first step had succeeded when she saw her daughter visibly relax at her words. She hoped there'd be no open objection from Suyu if the tadpole didn't recognize the web her mother was weaving. "Usually my eldest here is more than happy to help take care of them, but this incident has opened my eyes. I've been taking her for granted. It's high time my husband and I looked into hiring a babysitter so Su-chan can focus on her studies, and we can return to our work free of worry." "Oh my," Inko exclaimed, catching on to what her fellow mother was getting at. "That sounds like a wonderful idea. Izuku, you don't mind, do you?" The homely mother was absolutely beaming. She'd been aching to care for a little one again, and now here was an opportunity that came with 2. It was a wish come true. And earning a little extra to maybe get her precious boy something a little nicer for Christmas this year didn't sound too bad either. "Of course I don't," Izuku assured, unable to say no to his mother's smile. "Just don't do more than you can." Suyu had relaxed a little at this point, but not completely. There had to be more to her mother's offer than she was seeing. The woman wasn't one to be unduly kind to strangers. And as the one who she and her siblings had inherited their blunt honesty and intellect from, the frog girl knew she was right to be suspicious. "Great, we can talk details later, hero," Beru said, now turning to Izuku. "Also, this will make the next petition easier." Izuku. The green-haired teen wasn't the only one who snapped to attention when he was called. Suyu and Tae both stiffened in response to the frog woman's sudden focus on the hero in training. "Yes ma'am," Izuku answered, ready to listen. In his heart, He hoped he wasn't about to be asked to distance himself from Tsuyu. He treasured the new friendship he'd made dearly. I know this may be overstepping, or asking too much, but, the words sent Izuku's stomach sinking to his feet. He didn't like how this was sounding. Could you accompany my daughter to school from now on? I would feel much better if I knew you were by her side for a little while longer, Hiro. The Asui matriarch's request was met with speechless shock by all present, none more so than the daughter in question. Tsuyu couldn't believe how obvious her mother was being with her plan. The frog girl's shock quickly morphed to fear when she saw her savior shake himself and prepare an answer. She didn't know which would be worse, acceptance or denial. Either option terrified her. Of course, I would be honored. Such a firm and honest answer had Tsuyu turning red all over again, unable to cope with the new reality of her life. Her savior would continue to gallantly protect her even though her time of need had ended. Why you will, Hiro? The frog girl asked out of reflex before she could stop herself. Instantly she wished she could have bitten her tongue. The enthusiastic nod she received in response only deepened Tsuyu's blush. Her savior was almost too earnest in his naivety sometimes. Yes, as a matter of fact, I was going to ask to be allowed to do something like that anyway. Izuku hardly took a breath before continuing. Maybe to A&D from school actually. I mean, there's so much we don't know about my quirk still. There's still a chance you may feel, UMFH. The makings of a patented Izuku Midoriya mumbling episode was cut off before it could gather steam as Tsuyu decided to stop any further embarrassment, and lose of her mood, by forcing a piece of chicken into his mouth. We should eat before the food gets cold, Hiro, the frog girl said in defense of her action. So focused was she on getting her mind off of what had just happened that she failed to notice that she began to use the same chopsticks she'd used to feed Izuku. Eyes locked on her food, she also missed the matching grins the two mothers wore as they silently cheered at the indirect touch. Conversation drifted to more mundane topics from there. Both Inko and Beru smiled warmly as they chatted and watched their children. Both knew an inevitability when they saw one, but were more than willing to give a little push to get the ball rolling a bit faster. Izuku and Tsuyu's conversation turned to what to expect Monday, both doubting Mina would remain quiet about what she'd seen. The green duo was confident that at least Tokiyami would take their side, however, for Izuku's sake at least. That night, Asui family residence. After tossing and turning for who knew how long, Tsuyu gave up and admitted she couldn't get to sleep. No matter how much she tried, her mind wouldn't shut off and allow her to slumber. And she knew why. Thoughts of a certain green-haired teen that had freely given his own blood to save her life were completely filling her head. The frog girl felt silly. It was childish of her to be making such a big deal out of it. She was attending a school for heroes. She needed to act like a student of such was expected to, regardless of her feelings. But, what if he likes me, like that? Hiro, Tsuyu whispered, to herself or the dark room, she didn't know. Being so openly accepted despite her amphibian features was a novelty the frog girl just couldn't shake. It had been an unexpectedly warm comfort in an unfamiliar setting. Unlike her bed, which even in the familiarity of her bedroom still felt annoyingly cold and smelled quite plain for some reason. It was so unlike what she'd experienced the night prior. Hiro, Tsuyu bolted upright, startled. Her veins had just tickled her. In the back of her mind, a worming fear began to grow as she suddenly felt as if she could sense something familiar in the distance. It was too far away to reach, or even make an attempt to, but before she could even think more on it, a memory of the previous night surfaced in her stricken mind. As she'd lain on top of her savior, he'd told her that his blood sometimes felt like it tickled his veins as if answering him when he spoke. "Is that you, Izu-kun?" Tsuyu asked, looking down at herself, her veins. "Will you keep me warm at night again?" Hiro. The frog girl had to wonder, how much of this was the boy caring for her so much that not even distance could keep him from comforting her, and how much was her own yearning. Another sudden ticklish sensation assaulted her, causing her to feel a warmth spread through her. It wasn't as much as the real deal she'd experienced skin to skin against Izuku, but it was enough she understood she shouldn't be feeling the temperature change so much. She was supposed to be cold-blooded. Hiro. Tsuyu fell onto her pillow again, the giddy happiness she felt unable to be contained. Now she wanted Monday to arrive faster than ever so she could see her savior again. Same time, Midoriya residence. In his own bed, Izuku was hugging a spare pillow while warmly remembering the previous night. The memory of spending a whole night hugging a cute girl kept him so warm he could almost bask in it. He'd gladly take an opportunity to do such a thing again, although hopefully under less dire circumstances. The green-haired teen didn't think too hard on the fact he continuously failed to imagine a different girl in his arms other than Suyu whenever he tried to fantasize about another such night. It was too early in their friendship, heck their lives, to chase such goals. It could be disastrous if he tried to jump into such a thing without thought. The frog girl didn't even know about all of his faults, like the peculiar decorations adorning his room. I wonder if Su-chan would find this healthy. Izuku murmured to himself as he glanced around his room swathed in the shadows of night. Long gone were the days that even in darkness one could see the walls were covered in brightly covered posters of All Might and other top heroes, the shelves crammed with hero figurines, and the bookshelves packed with comics. Nowadays Izuku's room appeared more akin to one of a medical student in their residency. Medical posters covering all levels of anatomic detail were plastered on the walls. The bookshelf was stuffed with medical tomes, and the shelves, those were populated by plush dolls of all shapes and sizes. What? He couldn't live without cuteness. Even Tae, as she laid on the floor, enjoyed the company of a large rabbit doll. The zombie girl seemed to take a special pleasure in nibbling on the poor thing's ears. Monday, outside the Asui residence, early in the morning. Izuku was overflowing with nerves. This was the first time he'd ever stood outside of a home specifically because he was waiting for a girl, never mind it was to walk her to school. It made the green-haired teen feel like he was waiting for his girlfriend or something similar. The invasive romantic thought forced another blush across his face. The prospect of that kind of relationship made him happy, but filled him with fear as well. He couldn't entertain the idea of being with someone, especially Suyu, until they'd seen the worst of what he truly was. Steeling himself, he readied himself to call at the door. On second thought, maybe I should give her another 3 minutes. It's still early, Izuku trailed off, realizing he'd have to come face to face with Suyu's father soon, a thought that did nothing for his anxiety. Sure, he'd saved the man's daughter, but surely he'd still be cross with him for spending an entire night wrapped around the frog girl. Nothing had happened of course, but still. Tae groaned, plunking her head right on the button-like doorbell. A faint ding-dong could be heard inside the residence, letting Izuku know those inside now knew someone was at their door. You did that on purpose, didn't you? Izuku accused the zombie girl with more than a little disdain in his voice. Although he really couldn't blame Tae for her actions, if he'd been by himself it might have been hours before he'd gathered enough courage to do such a mundane thing. And that wouldn't fly since he'd already agreed he'd do this. And they had to get to class on time. The second the door to the home opened, a green missile shot out and tackled Izuku to the ground, leaving a confused Tae to blink at the now empty spot her master had occupied less than a second ago. Looking down at his chest, the green-haired teen discovered that the missile was actually none other than Suyu, who'd occupied herself with happily nuzzling him. Izuku hugged the frog girl without thinking, her absolute cuteness pulling a smile from him with ease. Then he looked up, and realized a large-ish man had also walked onto the scene. I'm in trouble, aren't I? Izuku asked who could only be Suyu's father. He hoped this wouldn't turn out too badly. The rather amphibious-looking man scratched the back of his head while taking in the scene before him. Then, he sighed. No son, you're not, Suyu's father replied, looking both amused and resigned at the sight of the two teens. But you will be if you let her dictate your entire life, Kiro. Before Izuku could ask what the man meant by that, Beru quickly stepped into the doorway. Did you say something, Ganma dear? Kiro, the frog woman asked as she hugged her husband's arm. Just remembering how much I love you. Ganma answered quickly before picking up a briefcase that had been sitting inside behind him. I've gotta run to the firm now. Enjoy your day, love, Kiro. The amphibious man touched his wife, gave one last smile in Izuku and Suyu's direction, and then hurried away. And if he'd had to force himself to ignore the sight of his daughter swooning over a boy a little more than it appeared he did. Well, no one asked. Meanwhile, at the Bakugo residence, Mitsuki's weekend had been horrible. Sleep had eluded her, but the worst thing was that her husband had completely stopped talking to her. Her nightmare was worsening every minute. The stable family she'd worked so hard for was crumbling away. If things didn't change soon, there wouldn't be a family at all. At least the Ashen mother had managed to arrange a meeting with the lawyers of the Asui and Iida families for the end of the week. It was her only chance at settling things outside of court, an infinitesimal chance to salvage the situation and maybe keep her family together. 1 week, we just need to survive for 1 week. After that, Mitsuki's words drifted into incoherency as she drank another shot of sake. She'd long since found it impossible to deal with her current reality while completely sober. Asking Inko, her longtime friend, for forgiveness, for which the homely woman had always been so free to give in the past, had been a hard-hitting bust. The green-haired mother had flat-out refused to take her calls, and the absence of any response to the numerous messages she'd left clued the Ashen woman in that this hadn't been a snap emotional decision. The Midoriya matriarch didn't want to talk to her. At all. Any hope of Inko appealing to the Asui and Iida families as a proxy for the Bakugos had since died. It was a bad omen for things to come if Ko-chan had finally had enough and turned away from Mitsuki. The Ashen mother felt a part of her heart quiver at the depressing thought. Is there anything in this pit to make breakfast with? Katsuki rudely asked as he jerked open the fridge. Finding only eggs, the blonde bit back a curse at the lack of options. He'd never admit it, but Katsuki had been much like his mother the previous nights. There'd been no sleep, no peace for him as he'd lain there, dying on the inside. Every time he'd closed his eyes, the blonde had only been able to see the inevitable events to come, where he'd be forced to discard his pride and dignity and beg like a dog for forgiveness. None of this nightmare would be happening if the freak had just engaged him in a straight fight. Everything being at stake like this was beeping Romero's fault. Katsuki still knew that to be true. But he'd already decided he'd play along and be a good boy. Nothing would ever make him give up his dream, even going through this humiliation. And one day he'd still be the undefeatable #1 hero. So the blonde swore to himself that someday he'd prove to everyone that he'd been right, and that the green beeping abomination had been in the wrong. Ua campus, before first bell. Izuku and Tsuyu had made it safely to UA's grounds, both blushing the entire walk. An awkward silence had hung over the duo the entire trek, one believing his mouth would betray him with strings of embarrassing words, the other fearing her body would betray her and cause her to reach out to lean against her savior. Both teens were either unaware or unable to recognize that their hands had been intertwined the entire time. Ah, Tay's soft, questioning groan forced the green duo to stop and turn to face her. We're not blushing. The denial was shouted in stereo, earning laughter from the random and ignorant second and third years that were passing by. Wondering at what was so funny, Izuku and Tsuyu noticed too late that yes, they were indeed blushing. The additional awkwardness that followed the discovery lasted until it inexplicably turned into laughter. I'm sorry about that, Izuku apologized, scratching the back of his head bashfully. It's just, I've been worried about you, you know. Wondering if you've been feeling okay. I don't want bad things happening to you. Tsuyu's already reddened cheeks deepened to a lovely rouge hue at the words of her savior. A small smile tugged at her lips, and the frog girl looked down to avoid eye contact. It's okay Izu-kun, Tsuyu said, flicking her eyes back and forth from her feet to the bright emeralds that were staring at her. I had to do my best not to call you. I thought you'd be worrying too much, but also, I missed you. The confession, spoken so softly, was almost missed by the green-haired teen. But as luck would have it, Izuku managed to hear the heartfelt words, and blushed all the more for them. Su-chan, Izuku said, wondering how he could phrase how he felt in that moment. He decided to let his rambling speak for him for once. You can call me whenever, for whatever. If you need me, I'll be by your side. I'll find a way to reach you, no matter what. I'm sounding weird again. Maybe letting his mouth go without his brain hadn't been such a good idea. The green-haired teen eventually conceded that his words were probably better suited for a boyfriend, but they had accurately described how he felt. Suyu merely giggled at her bumbling savior. For some reason, she felt like teasing him in the near future would be a delightful pastime of hers. UA campus, classroom 1A. Do you think Mina-chan said something to the rest of the class? Suyu asked as the two teens reached the door to their classroom. You know, about what happened in Recovery Girl's office. Izuku suppressed a shudder at the thought of what their pink-hued classmate could have said and done already. The acid user had never been malicious in her gossiping as far as the green-haired teen knew, but she often didn't think before she spoke, and topics that were supposed to be secrets were a major weakness of hers. I certainly hope not, Izuku replied uneasily as he opened the door for Suyu. The frog girl entered, stoic face appearing to be prepared for the worst. Following behind his friend, the green-haired teen let Tae close the door behind him. Silence. Complete and total, abysmal silence was all that greeted the green duo as soon as they walked into 1A's homeroom. That, and a lot of penetrating stares. The entirety of 1A that remained stared intently at the two teens, or more precisely, their intertwined hands. Some of these gazes were cold, more akin to glares, while others were envious. Quite a few were dripping with curiosity as well, and as should have been expected, Mina's in particular was chock full of mischief. It didn't take long for one Minoru Mineta to angrily hop out of his chair and stomp his way towards the green duo. Before he'd even fully reached his destination, the diminutive boy had taken out and shoved his phone in Izuku's face. How could you do this? How dare you even show your face around here after this? Mineta worked his way up to screaming, his voice pitched in despair. Not only did you already have a girl when we first met you, but now you have to go and flaunt this in front of us too. The picture backlit on the phone was of Izuku and Suyu in a rather daring position, their faces close enough to be preparing for a passionate touch. That the angle of the photo made it obvious to see that the frog girl's hospital gown had been completely open at the back at the time did nothing to dispel the apparent nature of the compromising position. Su-chan, is it true? Ochako asked, hesitantly approaching the frog girl. Did you really have to do stuff to get healed? For her part, Suyu couldn't immediately process what her normally bubbly friend meant by those words, but in the end it didn't matter. That one simple question had unleashed the floodgates. In the blink of an eye the green duo was swarmed and separated by their classmates. The two mobs were a cacophony of noise, multiple voices shouting and yelling over each other, asking one awkward question after another about the picture and what had transpired in the nurse's office behind closed doors. Both Izuku and Suyu immediately wished they'd thought to report themselves sick that morning, anything to avoid the trouble they were now facing. It was early in the morning and most of Class 1A had already arrived to the classroom. It was only nearing the end of their first week and they'd already faced their first crisis, their teachers' praises for their heroic efforts to save their classmates notwithstanding. Most felt like the only one who'd succeeding was Izuku. None really knew the details, but it was generally understood that he and Suyu had stared death in the face and, because of that, they were down one student. Excuse me everyone. Iida spoke loudly, worried about his fellows who'd suffered much worse than he. After all, he'd been able to return to class with only head bandages and his arm in a sling. Does anyone know if Midoriya and Asui will be able to return to classes soon? Both should be returning today, probably in better shape than you. Tokiyami answered lowly, earning the attention of the class. Midoriya's quirk happens to be extremely powerful, strong enough to easily heal Asui-san back to perfect health. Wait, you're serious? But she looked so heavily injured. Ochako was beyond impressed. She'd seen Suyu as the frog-like girl had been taken from the rubble. She'd looked half dead. Man, just how strong is his regeneration to be able to heal other people like that? Kaminari said with a whistle, wondering just what kind of tricks the green-haired boy would be able to do with that. Apparently, strong enough to reanimate dead people, Ojiro joined the conversation sharply, still feeling wrong about having a zombie as a sort of classmate. He constantly wondered when the monster would break and start biting without warning. I just hope Asui-san doesn't end up like that zombie girl he uses. Midoriya doesn't strike me like the type to allow that, Momo stated, I'm intrigued though, how does he even use his quirk on other people? This simple question gained everyone's attention, as it appeared no one had seen what their fellow classmate had done to keep Tsuyu alive. Tokiyami kept his own idea about what kind of ritual Izuku had used to himself, believing that if such information was to be made public it had to be his friend's choice, not wild speculation. Oh, I know what was involved, and it seemed to me to be very pleasant, Mina said as she and Toru were giggling over their phones. This gained them far too much attention. What do you mean? Kirishima asked, now curious about the kind of technique used. He was pretty sure that Izuku had a mutant-type quirk, not a transformation or emitter one. Mina and Toru descended into further giggling as they sent their picture to the rest of the girls and a few of the boys. By the time Tokiyami noticed what was happening, it was too late to act. The entire class fell into an uproar. Everyone could see the two's positions, the degree of intimacy shared, and the looks of love given and received. The girls as a whole couldn't quite squash feelings of envy. How was it that their friend, the one that shared too many features with frogs, had found such a loving boyfriend before them? Ashido, Hagakure, this is a violation of their privacy. Tokiyami's uncharacteristic yelling froze the two perpetrators wide-eyed in shock. The bird-headed boy was shaking in anger. And you should all wait for them to explain what's happening here before jumping to conclusions. Tokiyami couldn't help expressing his anger. He knew Izuku would do the same for him, be the first to side with him, should their situations be reversed. Such friendship was rare for him and he wouldn't betray it. Murmurings began to run wild. Some agreed with Tokiyami, others ignored his words and immediately began speculating on how close their two green-themed classmates had become. Then, the classroom's door opened. Silence. In walked Tsuyu and Izuku, holding hands, looking to all their classmates like a lovely couple in the middle of a date. Their faces shone with happiness. Largely unnoticed, Tae shambled in and took her normal place beside Izuku. There was no other way to put it, the two green classmates needed to be separated for deep interrogations. Stuff. What? Tsuyu couldn't make sense of what Ochako was suddenly asking her. 1 second she'd been next to Izuku and the next all the other girls had surrounding her, making her uncomfortable as they threw in words like, action, and, writing. I don't know what you're talking about. Izuku shouted as he was repeatedly asked for details regarding, doing the dirty, and, smashing, things. That's enough. Shota Aizawa, in true Eraserhead form, ordered as he entered his classroom. He didn't even have to raise his voice, so great was the utter terror his class experienced at his words and presence alone. He was beyond annoyed with the teens he called his students at the moment, unable to contain their curiosity like children. That being said, he supposed not allowing for any explanation of the green-haired boy's quirk would only lead to further annoyances. He might even be forced to yell, "Everyone, sit down," Aizawa drawled, his orders met with hasty action. "Midoriya, please explain how your quirk works, but do it quick." There was absolute silence as Izuku stood up at his seat. No one really wanted to mess with their gruff teacher, especially now with the noticeable absence of a certain explosive blonde. "Yes sir. Ahem. Everyone, my quirk, that's name no doubt will have to be changed very soon, allows my blood to repair any organic structure it comes into contact with, providing that there are enough nutrients to do so." Izuku explained. "For myself, that means any damage or sicknesses are repaired nearly instantly. So far, in the case of others, it can be directed to repair wounds of a diverse degree and keep vital organs functioning regardless of blood loss." Izuku did his best to think of any and all information he needed to provide to best explain what little he knew about his capabilities. "I haven't been able to test my quirk's full capacities yet. For example, I don't know if it'll work at a distance, so it's very possible I need to remain in contact with a patient to prevent mishaps." Unbidden, many eyes flicked to Tsuyu. "I'm not a zombie," Tsuyu said clearly after noticing the eerie silence that had enveloped the classroom. She could tell that many of her classmates were pondering on the high risk taken in order to save her, though shy snorts and nervous laughter sprouting here and there assured her that they all took her remark as a good reminder. Izuku had succeeded and there was no further danger for her. "So it was just you two taking precautions. Ochako jumped to apologize first, hoping to avoid revealing the mature nature of her true thoughts. Sorry for thinking stuff about you. But how does it work? If I get a paper cut, I get a hug. Mina, wishing to grab a measure of revenge for her gunk-covered phone and deleted pictures, quickly moved to derail the situation. No, not quite, Izuku replied honestly. I had her drink my blood. The green-haired teen knew very well how this information would sound to his classmates, drastic and disgusting. Momo was the first he noticed to react, her sudden pallor and covered mouth a dead giveaway. She did her best to smother the retching sounds crawling up from her throat, most likely possible due to her already having suspected such an action had been involved. That's so metal, Jiro burst, surprising all present. The enthusiastic shout gained her many stares. The life force of humanity lies in the blood, it is only natural it be the currency used as payment for a life. Tokiyami added his 2 cents, raising a blush to Izuku's cheeks at the sign of support. Tokiyami nodded to himself, caught up in his thoughts. Midoriya's blood must then, of course, be especially valuable to have stayed death's hand and to bring back the dead. Ah! Tei's sudden groan had Izuku twist away from his interrogators and hurriedly bow to their homeroom teacher. The gruff man looked 2 parts annoyed, 1 part surprised. I'm sorry for taking so long. We'll sit now. Izuku loudly apologized before collapsed into his seat. Job done. Tae stood back as she always had. Good. Now on to actual business. Aizawa instructed. Let's start by addressing the fact that since the exercise was cancelled due to the incident, you all will need to resume and complete it. Many of those who hadn't had their chance to show their mettle the previous day accepted the news with eager smiles, others of a more solemn nature merely nodded in acknowledgement. However, before you can leave for the training ground, I'm sorry to say there's something else you all must do. The grave words of their teacher sunk the mood of the room in an instant. You must choose the class presidents. If face vaulting had been a real thing, Izuku was sure that 90% of the room would have been on the floor after that remark. Ignoring the antics of his class, Aizawa continued. I don't care how you do it, just do it quickly. The man then turned his focus to the green teens of the room. Midoriya, Asui, once that's done, head down to Power Loader who heads the support courses to get temporary replacement suits. Our usual company that manufactures students' gear is taking too long to provide spares. 1 hour later, Izuku and Tsuyu walked hand in hand once again as they headed to the school's support facilities, quietly discussing the results of 1A's president selections. After the initial cacophony had refused to die down, it was Iida who'd suggested a democratic election. When no other ideas were submitted, the election began. Much to his surprise, Izuku was voted in as vice president to Momo, who'd won the top seat by 1 vote. The green-haired teen was shocked. He'd voted for Momo himself, not really wanting the attention of either position. You should have been the president, Hiro. Tsuyu said to the still reeling Izuku, who looked both lost and proud at the same time. You think so? I kinda think this is enough, Izuku replied as the two reached the entrance to the support classes. Maybe next year, if I can do things properly. Izuku was coming to understand that Tsuyu had been one of his 2 votes. He suspected the steadfastly supportive Tokiyami had been his second. Maybe, Hiro, but I think you're qualified enough now as it is. Tsuyu praised her savior, honestly surprised when she discovered Izuku's rather large notebook filled with ideas of gadgets and plans he and Tae could use as heroes. I mean, you've already got schematics for upgrades to your suits, and we've only had them for a day. That's not something many can achieve, Hiro. Oh, it's just kind of a hobby, Izuku replied, bashful in the face of the fact that he loved the positive attention. He wondered if he'd ever be able to tell the cute girl beside him that he actually liked her without endangering the friendship they'd built. A sudden groan from Tae caught both green-haired teens' attention. He has a notebook entry about me. How? Tsuyu's amazement at the revelation was tempered by her fear at the prospect. It's not a big deal, I just started it, Izuku said dismissively, having hoped to hide the existence of the notebook for a little longer. It's only, like, 20 pages long. The hard stare from his companion, however, dashed said hope. Suyu became incredibly stubborn regarding seeing her entry until, finally, Izuku broke and handed it over. Suyu spent the rest of the walk nose deep in the notebook Izuku had started filling with his classmates' data. She was slightly intimidated by the level of detail the notes contained about her quirk and its observed and hypothesized capabilities, her suit and its potential, and the many sketches that portrayed her as more beautiful than she knew she was. From all of this, Suyu could tell that her friend's observational skill was top-notch. He'd correctly guessed many of her quirk's abilities with only minor errors here and there, such as the length her tongue could extend. There were some side notes, like those postulating the toxins in her stomach could be weaponized, which were just plain wrong though. She had to admit, however, that she loved most of the suit upgrade ideas he'd proposed. Who'd have thought for her to use her own hair in her suit to boost the effectiveness of her meager camouflage ability? This should be the place, Izuku said, coming to a stop before another of the school's massive doors. Why is it steel-plated? Tae stepped forward and pressed a button to the side that turned out to be a doorbell. Suyu looked to the zombie girl in confusion. She hadn't heard Izuku ask for her to do that. Less than a minute later, the steel door shuttered before opening, revealing a middle-aged man wearing a helmet reminiscent of a bulldozer's claw. Power loader. Izuku was quick to beam at the famous hero. Suyu was quick as well, pinching his cheek to contain any chances of fanboying. You must be the students that needed their suits repaired, Come in. Power loader was quick to show his hospitality to the green-haired duo and the tall girl accompanying them. Are they here? Can I see the zombie? Where's the zombie? The rapid-fire questions were all but screamed by a pink-haired girl as she appeared out of nowhere next to Power Loader. Seeing the new arrivals, the Rosette jumped forward and circled Izuku, Suyu, and even Tae excitedly. Izuku offhandedly noticed the girl's eyes were shaped like crosshairs. Hatsume, behave, Power Loader boomed, quick to chastise his energetic student. Why would he bother to bring such a creature here anyway, It has nothing to do with his suit. Actually, Izuku cut in, confused at the misunderstanding but unwilling to abuse it. He knew that Tae didn't appear like people expected, but that only made the revelation worse when the truth came out. Tae here is the zombie. Kid, that isn't something to joke about. Power Loader said as Hatsume snatched up Tae's arm. Pressing 2 fingers to her wrist, she checked for a pulse. Holy moly, she doesn't have a pulse. Hatsume's voice was much too happy for the words spoken. It kind of creeped Izuku out, and he definitely didn't want some random student to start experimenting on Tae. I think our suit repair is more, Suyu began to say, lifting up the bag that contained the scraps of their first hero costumes. Fast as lightning, the bag was in Hatsume's hands before the frog girl could finish her sentence. No problem, the Rosette said happily, completely distracted at the prospect of working on the bag's contents. Power Loader, however, grabbed said bag with the urgency one usually saw when taking away a loaded weapon from a curious child. Unless it's related to upgrading, you're not touching anyone's suits, Missy. The excavation hero warned, shaking a finger. The last time you tried, you made a horrible mess out of it. You're lucky the semester hadn't started yet, or I'd have failed you right there. Hatsume pouted at her mentor. Then, like a switch was flipped, the Rosette spun and grabbed Izuku by the shoulders. You wouldn't happen to have anything else, would you? Hatsume asked pleadingly, earning a giggle from Izuku. Anything, maybe some schematics. Seeing the amused look Izuku was giving, the Rosette brought a frown to Suyu's face. She unexplainably had the sudden urge to put herself between Izuku and the new girl. As a matter of fact, Izuku trailed off as he brought out one of his notebooks. Immediately, a beaming Hatsume took the bound pages. It started slowly, but soon Izuku and Suyu began to get worried as the Rosette's giggles rose to that of a mad woman's as she became absorbed by the notebook's contents. Before long, Power Loader waved the two away, reminding them that they'd be able to come back in 4 days for their suits. Setting out for the training area, Izuku couldn't help but spend the relatively quiet walk thinking about the body language he'd observed from Suyu. For some reason, it looked like she'd really gotten upset with the Hatsume girl. So, was there something you wanted to talk about regarding the girl we just met? Izuku finally asked, too curious to find out why his friend had been so standoffish. No, nothing at all, Kiro. Tsuyu's reply came too quickly, too smoothly. The fact that she also avoided eye contact and sported a large frown only made Izuku's worry increase. Tae suddenly groaned, earning attention. Jealous? Izuku asked, stopping in his tracks. His mind needed a moment to process this new information. That's not true, Tsuyu shouted back, embarrassed for being caught so easily by the undead girl. Jealous of what? Izuku asked. What could Tsuyu, who was beyond cute, had a powerful quirk, and the drive to get into the best hero school in eastern Japan be jealous of? Speaking of, the girl in question shuffled in place, before the inquisitive eyes of her savior broke her restraint. She's got bigger. I mean, she's more feminine, Tsuyu mumbled, doing her best to avoid the real answer to the question. She hoped a superficial answer would satisfy Izuku, pointing first to her chest, then her face. The green teen immediately came to the wrong conclusion, but his reaction still fit appropriately. Su-chan, a woman's worth should never be measured by the size of her s. Izuku began with a straight face, before it bloomed into a sweet smile. Besides, I think the cuteness of your face is better than hers anyway. Tsuyu felt her heart do a flip. Subtly, the frog girl pressed a hand against her chest, willing the wily organ to behave. And, I mean, it's not like we're dating, Izuku finished. You shouldn't bother yourself with what I might think. Tsuyu was reeling. She completely forgot. They weren't dating. They weren't even a couple, yet. Why yeah, you're right. Tsuyu said. How silly of me, Hiro. Thoughts. A million thoughts sped through Tsuyu's mind in an instant. How could she get Izuku to take the first step in making, whatever they were, official? Did she really want that? She was surprised to hear the answer blare in her mind. Yes. I didn't know we could get canned coffee on campus. Izuku's excited shout broke Tsuyu from her thoughts. Now I really want one. Oh well. Desire for coffee gone as quickly as it came. Izuku had taken only 3 steps before he heard the telltale sound of a vending machine expending a beverage. What? Here, Tsuyu said, pushing the newly acquired coffee into his hands. Stopping, Izuku turned and stared at the frog girl's red eyes. Su-chan, why did you do that? Izuku asked slowly. He really wished his stomach didn't feel like it had just dropped to his feet, but it did. Because you wanted it, Tsuyu replied with a cute smile, red eyes shining. Now, this might sound weird but... Stop. Like a machine, Tsuyu instantly froze. Red eyes wide, the frog girl stared up at Izuku expectantly, just like Tae did. Izuku felt his bad feeling darken further. Su-chan, do you like coffee? Izuku asked. Maybe she was just toying with him. He didn't know if he could bear it if he'd hurt his friend like he was beginning to suspect he had. No, I actually find it revolting, Hiro. Tsuyu replied, a childhood memory of accidentally taking a sip of her father's morning coffee blinking before her mind's eye. She'd regretted that mistake for the rest of the day, as had her stomach. Su-chan, drink this coffee. Izuku ordered. He watched in absolute horror as Tsuyu grabbed the can back, opened it, and downed the drink in one go. What? Tsuyu asked, now confused. Why was her savior crying? Su-chan, I'm sorry, I'm so sorry. Izuku collapsed to his knees as he sobbed his apology. Tsuyu's confusion deepened. She couldn't understand what was making him so sad. All she'd done was find out that coffee no longer made her feel sick. Nurse's office, half an hour later. Ditching class to go to the nurse's office was a heavy decision for Izuku, but he made it in order to ensure Tsuyu's safety. Recovery Girl had taken one look at the teary-eyed boy and immediately paged Aizawa. The situation was delicate, and had the potential for a real tragedy in the making. For his part, Aizawa had completely understood his student's distress. While no one could have predicted something like this happening, and no harm had been intended, there was no denying damage had been done, and that beget consequences. These are the results of the scans. Recovery Girl said after her various machines had spit out their findings and she'd had a chance to process them. While she'd hoped it would have been under better circumstances, she was glad that she had an opportunity to scan the Asui girl after some time had passed. The more data they could get on Izuku's quirk, the better. She also couldn't deny that she enjoyed scanning the zombified Yamada girl either, as it meant more data for her research. "What are we looking at?" Aizawa asked on behalf of his students as all present stared at the monitor recovery girl had directed their attention to. "I've managed to mark Izuku's cells so that they'd contrast against cells natural to another. So, here, in Miss Asui's case, we can see there's a high concentration in her brain. Compared to Miss Yamada here, which as you can see have his cells spread around vital organs such as the stomach and lungs." During her explanation, Recovery Girl made sure to point out each item on the monitor. "Will she be alright?" Izuku begged to know. Will she be herself again? He couldn't deal with this. He wanted to die for doing such an evil thing to such a great person, regardless of his intentions. "Well, that's hard to say," Recovery Girl replied. "There seems to be a lower number of your cells present than the last time we scanned Miss Asui. I would assume that means that once they die out completely she should be completely free of your control." Izuku didn't like how the youthful heroine made the idea sound more theoretical than assured to occur. "What if she doesn't return to her previous self?" Izuku asked, more tears ready to fall at the prospect. "Then I stay by your side, and you stay by mine, like you promised," Tsuyu announced with a smile. "I know you won't abuse this power." Izuku wanted so much to believe his friend, but he just couldn't. To his eyes, her smile appeared empty and her words supplied by his blood. This wasn't Tsuyu he was talking to. "We can try something, if you'd like." Recovery Girl motioned to Aizawa. "Shota-kun, would you kindly?" Those in the know knew that Shota Aizawa's quirk, Erasure, had never been able to work on mutant types. However, what few knew was that it could work on the transformative effects of those quirks. One of Recovery Girl's theories was that the control aspect of Izuku's quirk would fall under this minuscule loophole. "Midoriya, order Asui to do something she might normally refuse," Aizawa instructed. Preparing himself, the gruff man pulled on that little piece of himself that he mentally allocated as being his quirk. Unbidden, his hair rose to rigidity and he knew his eyes glowed red. For less than a moment, he thought he saw Asui's eyes return to their original color. "Su-chan, pick your nose," Izuku ordered, almost getting a snort from the older male. Meanwhile, the elderly heroine felt like face-palming. She'd expected a demand for a touch or something. "Why would I do that?" Tsuyu asked, embarrassed at the mere idea of doing something so vulgar, in front of people no less. Izuku grabbed his friend's hands in his, staring intently into wide eyes. "Do you feel weird? Does anything hurt?" Izuku asked, elated that it looked like his friend was no longer controlled by his blood. "No, maybe a little less warm than before, but nothing that I would say feels wrong," Tsuyu replied flatly. Izuku was beside himself. She sounded exactly as she had before her injuries, cute, but not in a way that felt like an attempt to sound appealing to him. "Well, that settles that," Recovery Girl stated, proud that she'd once again been proven right. She'll be back to normal once all of the foreign cells die out. While she was glad to see a potential problem for two of the school students resolve itself, Chio had to be honest with herself, she was slightly disappointed. Her plans for further experimentation would have to wait for now. Oh well, in a school like this, she mused, there was no doubt that there'd eventually be more test subjects. "Midoriya," Aizawa called, satisfied when he saw the boy immediately snap to attention. "I want you to write out a full report on this newfound side effect. After that, you'll send a formal apology to the Asui family for any inconvenience that result from it." Nodding along with his teacher's directions, Izuku had already pulled out a smaller notebook and was jotting down his new assignments. "While nothing unfortunate occurred this time, the QRA will also surely require you to take an oath pledging to forsake abuse of this aspect of your quirk," Aizawa continued, internally sighing at all the work this problem child was creating so early in the school year. "Also, you're forbidden from using this part of your quirk unless given permission by a teacher and under supervision." "Understood." Unable to fight the itch of his dry eyes any longer, Aizawa deactivated his quirk. Immediately, Suyu moved to wrap her arms around one of Izuku's. Crystal clear, sir. Izuku followed his assertion with a salute, still feeling guilt. He couldn't help but berate his naivety in believing he'd actually be lucky enough to enjoy the attentions of a girl in her right mind. Before you all go, there's another test I need to run. Recovery Girl requested. I would like Shota-kun to use his quirk on Miss Yamada. Surprise, dread, these emotions and more filtered through the room at the nurse's proposal. Izuku provided most of the dread, since it was entirely possible Tae was about to drop dead, for good, and half his hero potential would be lost in an instant. He also found, to his surprise, he truly didn't want to lose the zombie girl after living with her for so long. The reason? Aizawa probed, knowing that studying the zombie was important, but unwilling to damage the potential of one he considered a good student. We need to know if it's just the means of communication your quirk's breaking, or if the cells are shutting down. Recovery Girl explained. If it's the former, Midoriya here needs to develop a way to handle possible quirk interrupters. If it's the latter, we might be able to accelerate Asui's recovery. I understand, Izuku said, knowing that no matter how much it might hurt him, this needed to be done. Tae, Aizawa-sensei is going to use his quirk now. There's a chance it might make you go to sleep. If you don't want to wake up again, that's okay. If being free makes you happy, you don't have to wake up. Recovery Girl watched the almost grieving boy in confusion. Did he really feel so connected to a corpse? Are you done? Aizawa asked, making use of his years of underground hero work to pull off a cold-sounding tone. He might be worried about the possible ramifications that this might bring, but he also had a reputation to uphold. He couldn't believe he just thought that. Wordlessly, Izuku nodded, taking a handful of steps back. Taking a breath, Aizawa stared intently at the zombie girl. If he looked hard enough, would he find any traces of her former humanity? Pushing the pointless thought aside, he activated his quirk. Tae didn't drop dead. In fact, she stood completely still, proving that she was capable of standing in wait without any outside stimuli from Izuku. Then, those still among the living noticed the growling. Aizawa only had a moment to decipher the look of absolute hatred being directed at him before the zombie girl launched herself at him with a speed that belied her form. Og! The gruff teacher's scream was drowned out by the growling snarls of the berserking zombie girl as he was tackled to the ground. Aizawa could have sworn he was being mauled by a grizzly bear and not a young girl. He tried to raise an arm in defense, but it was swiftly grabbed and snapped like a twig in the face of the undead girl's ire. The sudden shock of the pain caused his quirk to deactivate. Less than 5 seconds had passed. Finally snapping out of his own shock, Izuku jumped into action to stop the frenzied zombie. Tae, stop. Instantly, the zombie girl ceased all aggressive movement. In the blink of an eye, she had returned to her cute-faced, adorable demeanor. Stepping over Aizawa, Tae moved toward Izuku, likely awaiting her next command. Sensei, are you all right? Izuku asked, full of worry. If he hadn't feared expulsion before, it was definitely a huge concern now. Still standing by her computer, Recovery Girl couldn't help but notice that Asui seemed completely unfazed by what had just transpired. If she hadn't known better, the expression on the girl's face could have almost been taken as tacit approval of the retaliation. My arm is broken, and I think I have a bruised rib, Aizawa deadpanned. Why is she so strong, Midoriya? She was reported quirkless. Grasping onto his student's outstretched hand, Aizawa hauled himself up. He was done with today. All he wanted now was to get a touch for his injuries and go to bed. He received the touch quickly enough. She is quirkless, Shota-kun. Recovery Girl began to explain. She just no longer has any of the mental limiters that the rest of us have naturally. Her strength comes from being able to force her muscles to perform at maximum power. Broken bones and ruptured muscle fibers. No longer a concern for her either with her regeneration. While she explained the zombie girl's supernatural strength, Recovery Girl kept an eye on Izuku as he went about, reassuring the corpse her episode wasn't her fault. What was with this boy? More importantly, she decided to mark the incident off as the result of trying for too much, too soon. Perhaps, like an alcoholic, those affected by the boy's quirk became dependent on it. She'd have to find the proper balance between zombification and embedment if she wanted to put her plan into action. After making numerous assurances that there'd be no trouble for the attack, Aizawa sent his students to resume their classes, with the express understanding that nothing they'd witnessed was to be spoken of with anyone else. Quickly agreeing, the two students and Zombie all but fled the room. Knowing that they'd already missed seeing their classmates performing their combat exercises, once outside Izuku stopped and wrapped Tsuyu in a hug. He might have felt beyond grateful that Tae remained by his side, but guilt still consumed him regarding his friend. He had to alleviate his heart somehow, even if it meant dealing with a different sort of pain. Aizu-kun. Tsuyu was in heaven, the hug conveying all the feelings she'd been afraid to make known. She could feel all the love she'd ever desired flowing into her from the arms of her savior. This was it, he was going to take the step she'd been waiting for. "I like you, Su-chan, I really do." Izuku started. He had to stop though, to swallow down his treacherous heart. "Nothing would make me happier than to skip the rest of school today and go out on a date with you." Tsuyu could die happy now, especially when she knew her savior would just bring her back. He'd said it. He wanted to date her. But to do that, Izuku continued, causing Tsuyu to frown in worry, "I need you to be yourself. To be free of any outside control." No, no, no. Why was he saying this? Tsuyu couldn't understand. Where was he going with this? "That's why I'm giving you this one, irrevocable order," Izuku said with a heavy heart. Tsuyu didn't like the tears that were building in her savior's eyes. "From this moment on, and until you can freely disobey me, you are forbidden from touching me." Izuku fought through the tearing of his heart to give the order. He wished his blood was weak enough for the frog girl to instantly disobey him. Hell, he'd even take a few hours, but he knew it was useless to hope for such. "Hero." Tsuyu stumbled back in surprise, which only compounded when she found herself loosening her grip on Izuku's arm. Desperately, she tried to tighten her grip, but her body betrayed her. Unable to resist the command, the frog girl found herself stepping away from her savior, her happiness. Refusing to accept what had just happened, she reached for him, but it was like an invisible barrier she couldn't force herself to pass had been erected. "This is for your own good, Su-chan," Izuku said through a face full of tears, guilt deadening his every word. "When my blood finally dies off, you'll thank me for this. And I promise, when you're yourself again, I'll give you anything you want in compensation for doing this to you. Even my life." "I don't want this, Izu-kun." Tsuyu cried out in absolute distress. She'd wanted him to claim her, order her to be his girlfriend, his princess. "Not this, never this. Don't worry, I'm still escorting you to your home," Izuku said with false confidence, strong words that failed to hide the misery underneath. "Let's get to class. We can't let this get in the way of our education." Gua. Tae's groan sounded too much like that of a concerned older sister. Izuku almost broke down. "No, Tae, I don't think I'm going to be okay. I feel like a monster." Izuku walked away, toward the classroom. Tsuyu followed closely, Tae keeping herself back to make sure the distraught frog girl wouldn't be left behind. "You're not a monster, Izu-kun," Tsuyu shouted, vacillating between heartbreak and rage. "It hurts so much. I don't want to be free. Revoke the order." Time and time again, Tsuyu attempted to hug her savior's arm, but each time, she was rebuffed as her body just refused to follow her demands. Every time, her heart broke a little more. Izuku grimaced at the sight of what would be his near future. He dreaded the prospect of explaining the true monstrosity of his crime to Tsuyu's parents, who'd foolishly trusted him with their daughter. And if he somehow survived the ire of the Asui family, he still had to deal with the larger picture. How will society look upon him when it was discovered that his quirk didn't just make zombies, but thralls as well? The third night since Izuku had become aware of his crime against Tsuyu, he could be found in his room, crying. His guilt weighed on him heavily and, outside of pulling himself together to focus while at school or during training, he was unable to cope with the realization of what a monster he really was. That afternoon, 3 days ago, when he'd returned Tsuyu to her parents, he'd knelt before the confused parents, explained in excruciating detail everything that had gone so wrong, and offered everything he had, even his life, as recompense. He'd expected yelling, a beating, and even lethal violence in return. Instead, Beru had surprised him with forgiveness. The Asui matriarch had assured him that it was thanks to him and his quirk that Tsuyu had survived at all, and living with the consequences that ignorance of its side effects had caused was still better than the alternative. She'd also pointed out that it had been impossible for anyone to know his quirk's full potential at this point in time, and that blaming him for lack of knowledge wouldn't be right. The concerned mother had, however, demanded that if Tsuyu failed to recover he would accept responsibility for life. "I don't deserve their forgiveness," Izuku muttered to himself as he tossed around in his bed. He'd considered and discarded the idea of suicide already. His sense of responsibility to ensure his friend's recovery came before all else. "Su-chan, I'm sorry," Izuku's mutterings continued through his tears and the building pressure over his heart. He wished he could pray for redemption or at least atonement, but a monster like him didn't even deserve the chance. Why was it even when he tried to do good, it only ended in suffering? The day after the revelation, and his subsequent order, had been absolute hell, for him and no doubt Tsuyu as well. The frog girl had done her best to grab his arm, give him a hug, anything she could think of to touch him, nothing worked. She'd resorted to begging him to reconsider his order, to enjoy the control until it wore off. She'd assured him that her feelings were real, only being boosted by the effects of his blood. Their classmates were obviously confused by the sudden shift in their interactions, suspecting something but unsure as to its magnitude. When Tsuyu, in palpable despair, had stomped her foot and outright demanded he revoke his order, in front of their whole class, he'd had to take an additional measure. Order number 2. Do not bring up the topic of revoking orders. It was then that the others had reached the completely correct conclusion that the frog girl was somehow under his control. Surprisingly, it was Mina and Mineta who took the discovery the worst, both quick to suggest, in their own ways, that Izuku would or already was taking advantage of Tsuyu's obedience to enjoy her body. Denki had followed that by commenting that he should have aimed for a better mark, suggesting Momo as his own would-be target. The crass statement had earned the blonde a slap to the face and an ear jack to the eye. Out of the others present, only Tokiyami had openly stepped forward in total, open support. I wish I hadn't been born evil," Izuku muttered, wallowing in the darkness within his mind. "It would be better if I just died." Finally, further mentally and emotionally exhausted than when the day had begun, Izuku slipped into unconsciousness. Had he stayed awake a moment more, he would have felt it when a figure, cloaked in shadow, approached his bed. Unnoticed, the intruder slipped into his bed, wrapping their arms around the sleeping teen. Izuku knew he was dreaming. He knew because what lay before him was his own personal hell. The people most important to him stood surrounding him in judgment. They decried the evils lurking below his skin, pointed to his sins demanding answers, and whispered the truth of his hateful existence. And he deserved every word of hate, every bay for his blood to be spilt. "I never should have given birth to you," Inko spat hatefully, glare full of heated resentment. Izuku could see them, this phantasm's thoughts. If only he'd never been born, Inko could have retained her youthful beauty. If he hadn't existed, his father would still be around, and if not, then she could have easily found a new husband. He was unwanted dead weight, only dragging her down. "I never should have allowed you near my daughter," Beru was next, literally puffed up in rage. Had it not been for him, Bakugo would have never resorted to his overpowered surprise attack. If it hadn't been for him, Tsuyu would have never faced death so young. More and more witnesses came forward, more and more charges were laid upon Izuku's shoulders. He took them all silently, dreading who he knew to be next, and last. Tsuyu appeared, as he knew she would, from behind the wall of scowls and glares. The green-haired teen fell to his knees, as he had for 2 nights now, wishing with all his heart that he wouldn't be forced to hear the frog girl announce her hatred for him, her loathing for being bound to him as a beep. "Thank you, for being born Izu-kun," softly whispered a voice into Izuku's ear, "thank you for living, for being yourself." Eyes blown wide, Izuku couldn't get his body to move. He might have only heard this voice once before, but he knew it. Shaking with the effort, The green-haired teen managed to turn himself around, to see the source of such words of comfort. It was Tae. And she was smiling. But, I see couldn't. Izuku gave up speaking, racked with sobs too strong to overcome. He'd failed this beautiful girl, he'd let her die on the cold ground when he could have saved her. Worse, he'd spent every day after using her body for his own benefit. Perhaps not as wickedly as those before him, but he was evil for it just the same. But you did, Tae chirped, looking extremely pleased with herself. You saved something more important than my life, my soul. The undead girl, who Izuku now noticed appeared decidedly less undead than usual, looped her arms around him in a warm hug. All Might and all those other heroes might have been able to stop those bullets, even lead me to safety, Tae continued, but you did something they'd never have been able to do. You restored my faith in humanity. You saw me as someone worth saving. And that made me clean. Pulling back slightly, Izuku saw the natural pale skin of Tae's face reddened by smiling tears. The undead girl spoke in a warm tone, full of support and love. It almost reminded him of his mother. Aren't you angry with me? I use your body. Izuku shouted his question, a long-held guilt overflowing. You could rest in peace if I wasn't such a goddamned coward. This was it. Izuku knew he might never again have a chance to ask the Ravenet what she wanted. Dream or not, he had to take this opportunity. The look he received, however, perplexed him. Why would I ever hate you? Tae asked, laughing quietly. You're allowing me to fulfill one of my own dreams, you know. Had he heard that right? Izuku knew he was dreaming, but this was pushing even the limits of his beliefs. When I was a little girl, I wanted nothing more than to be a hero, Tae said, locking eyes with the teen in her arms. I wanted to be strong, defend the weak. But, I was born quirkless, the epitome of weak and powerless. The Ravenet slid her hands to cup Izuku's face, a tender look settling on her own. But then you came, and suddenly I have the strength to defeat someone as strong as Eraserhead. A real dream come true. Izuku was beyond reeling. What was this feeling building up in his chest? Had he really helped someone else reach their dream? Or was he going crazy? Do you think Su-chan will ever forgive me? That was the question to end all questions. Izuku knew that the frog girl's acceptance meant more than anyone else's he could think of. Save maybe his mother's. Maybe, ask her yourself. Tae shot back, playfully turning Izuku's face to the crowd behind them. Confused, the green-haired teen offered no resistance. Now about-faced, Izuku looked back at his jury once more. Standing at the fore, was Tsuyu. The frog girl stared back, the biggest, most pure smile Izuku had ever seen on her face. Then he woke up. Later that morning, now the fourth day, Izuku and Tae, with Tsuyu slightly behind, arrived at Yue's entrance with little pomp or circumstance. The morning had been strange, at least for the single male of the trio, and he wasn't quite sure how to feel about it. First, he'd woken up in the protective embrace of Tae. Somehow she'd crawled into his bed during the night, without waking him up, and wrapped herself around him. Then, when he'd arrived at the Asui household, Tsuyu had received him without a word. For the entire trip, she'd avoided looking at him, sitting in silence. It had been unsettling. Anyo, Su-chan, Izuku wasn't sure how to begin asking his friend if she were fine or upset. If she were going through some kind of pain, like withdrawal from his blood, are you okay? Suddenly a finger was poking his cheek. It was rather forceful. You, oh, me. The words, though not as harsh as he'd expected, were the most heavenly sound Izuku had heard in 4 days. Then he realized, he had a finger touching his face. Su-chan, you're free. Pure elation was all Izuku could feel, the emotion thrumming through every fiber of his being. He hardly noticed the finger that poked him in the face a second time. You owe me, hero, Tsuyu repeated, poking the male before her in the cheek a third time. It did nothing to erase the idiotic smile that was blinding her. Are you ready to pay? Anything you want, Izuku cried, all smiles and teary eyes. Just ask and it's yours. Well, Tsuyu paused, batting down the butterflies in her stomach. I'll think about your punishment later. For now, I need you to understand I don't hate you, hero." Seeing an objection coming, Tsuyu poked Izuku a fourth time. I don't hate you, or resent you, or fear you." Knowing the poor boy before her had just gone through a severe crisis, mothers talked amongst themselves after all, Tsuyu pushed forward, determined to get her message through. "You did everything to save me. Without you, I'd be dead. So, thank you, hero. Thank you, you don't know." Izuku began to break, speaking his gratitude between sobs. Tsuyu couldn't bear to watch. She hated making a scene. "Don't be weird, Izuku," Tsuyu said with a straight face. Seeing her companion wipe his face to look at her, she tried for a more menacing stare. "Stop crying, and remember, you owe me. I'm going to be ordering you around for a long time, hero." Her best attempt to be stern did nothing to erase Izuku's smile or tears of happiness. "Hua." Tei's groan caught Tsuyu's attention. The frog girl threw Izuku a questioning stare while pointing at the zombie, who realized that his friend could no longer understand the zombie language. "She's happy that we're friends again," came the watery and meek reply. Izuku didn't want to jump to any conclusions. "We never stopped being friends," Tsuyu replied in her long mist-neutral tone. "It's just that I wasn't myself for a while, hero." Noticing how close it was to homeroom starting, both green teens quickly reached a silent agreement to avoid tackling any supposed feelings for now. Neither felt ready to acknowledge the existence of such as of yet, nor tread the path they opened before them. Meanwhile, in his office in the depths of UA, Principal Nezu was in the process of receiving terrible news over the phone. Someone dear to him had just lost his child. The scientist, although one of those who'd initially taken part in the experiments he'd suffered in the past, had eventually been the one instrumental in him gaining his freedom. The two had kept in contact over the years, and it hurt to learn that such a man, perhaps one of the few humans he could stand, was now forced to endure such pain. To make matters worse, he hadn't even received the information of the child's passing from the man himself. It had been the woman that he'd insisted on marrying who'd called. And according to the child's stepmother, it had been suicide. Knowing in his bones that the little bundle of sunshine he'd met numerous times in past wouldn't commit such an action, Nezu knew there was more to the story than what he was being told. Unfortunately, the woman opposed even the notion of an autopsy, which, with his friend overseas and unable or unwilling to answer calls, left him little room to investigate. Luckily for him, he did have that quirk that he'd been tortured so extensively for, and it easily allowed him to remember a key factor he could use to his advantage. "Tsukauchi-san, I have a favor to ask of you," Nezu stated to the confused and now surprised detective, who'd only just arrived to the school and entered the office after an unexpected call from the principal. "I need you to bring the body of a certain child to my school." "Wah! I can't do that, Nezu," the detective shouted. "That would break so many laws I'd be." "Have no fear," Nezu cut in, waving away the legitimate concerns of the panicking man. "I have a way to gather the information I desire without having to lift a single blade. The body won't be harmed." Recognizing the unbending determination in the quirked animal's eyes, the detective eventually acquiesced. Before leaving on his task, however, he did manage to extract a promise that nothing untoward would happen to the body he was about to procure and that it'd be returned immediately if foul play wasn't discovered. "Takeo-kun, please forgive my coming actions," Nezu said to a portrait hanging on his office's back wall. "Know that I only defile your baby to bring justice to those responsible. It's the least you, and this child, deserve." Staring up at the portrait, Nezu reminisced on the time portrayed, when a younger him would ride the shoulders of a giant without care, while the colossal man cradled a tiny babe in his massive hands. A couple of hours later, trudging through the halls, Izuku's mind was overloading, attempting to figure out the reason he'd been called to the principal's office. When Present Mike, their current period's teacher, had received the message requesting his presence, the class had erupted into pandemonium. Half of his classmates were sure he was about to be expelled for the side effects of his quirk, or at least suspended pending review. The other half, those who supported him, believed he was going to receive recognition for saving a life, as well as saving face for the academy. Tsuyu, still feeling twinges of guilt for being unable to keep a lid on it while under the effects of Izuku's control, feared the worst. Quietly, she followed her friend as he trekked to his fate, completely ignoring the shouting from Present Mike to return to her desk and that only Izuku had been called. "You called for me, sir?" Izuku asked, knocking on the principal's office door. Entering immediately as instructed by Present Mike's message, the green-haired teen was closely followed by Tae. Unable to gather her courage in time, Tsuyu was left outside as the door closed. Cursing her indecision, the frog girl swore she'd enter should she hear things escalate. "Midoriya-kun, thank you for being so prompt," Nezu greeted lightly while standing on his desk. "Please meet Detective Tsukauchi. He's our contact of choice when working with the police department and the head of their CSI division. Tsukauchi, this here is Izuku Midoriya, the student I've told you about." As introductions were given and hands shaken, Izuku idly noticed the plain appearance of the tall, black-haired man. He looked completely unremarkable, a trait he could empathize with. The older man did rock a trench coat that added a flair of mystique to him though. "Midoriya-san, it's a pleasure to meet you," Tsukauchi said before turning to Tae. "And I assume this pretty young lady is your undead companion." Tsukauchi's neutral tone was refreshing for the green-haired teen, who was too used to misunderstandings and faces of horror. "Pleased to meet you, sir," Izuku replied, Tae letting out a groan in apparent acknowledgement. "And yes, was Tae Yamada. She's my partner." With pleasantries out of the way, Nezu hopped back to his chair, sitting down smoothly before turning back to his audience. Noticing the nervous glances from his student, the quirked animal let out a small, jolly laugh. "Let me start by assuaging your fears, Midoriya-kun. You're not here to be suspended, or expelled, or heavens forbid arrested," Nezu reassured. The instant he saw the green-haired teen begin to relax, he continued with his explanation. "In fact, you've been called here due to a favor I must ask of you. Think of it as an extracurricular activity, one that will allow you to help someone in need." The quirked animal was delighted to see the completely solid look of determination that came over Izuku's face at the news. The boy truly had a strong drive to help others in need. But the question was, how strong was that resolve? "Sir, I know I'm cursed, and a monster to boot, but if it's for someone in need, I'll do everything in my power to help." Tsukauchi felt his respect for the green-haired teen increase instantly. Such drive was admirable, but he still wondered if the young man would really be up to the task. "While I'll overlook your grossly inaccurate comments about yourself this time, Midoriya-kun, I do believe in your intent," Nezu said, frowning at how openly one of his students could voice their self-hatred. "Tsukauchi, if you would." Nodding, the detective handed a manila folder to the green-haired teen. Opening it, Izuku began to flip through pages he was pretty sure he shouldn't be looking through. As he read, Tsukauchi began to explain the case. Victim's name was Masao Go. Reportedly found this morning, dead, hanging from the dresser in his room. The information washed over Izuku, whose analytical mind was beginning to build a profile. His stepmother claims it was suicide due to the pressure he was facing from appearing on television for an upcoming show. The picture presented in the file was of a young child, no older than 10 years of age. With a precious smile, cute facial features, and a petite build that was topped with long light blue hair pulled back into ponytails, Izuku noted that Masao Go could easily pass as a little girl. However, the death is suspicious, Tsukauchi continued, catching the interest of the frowning green-haired teen. Go-san wasn't meant to appear as himself on the show. He cross-dressed under the alias of Lily Hoshikawa, which he'd used to win his spot on the show in the first place. Whispers were, Lily was on the fast track to becoming an idol. That means the social pressures he would have faced in the outside world should have been minimal, Nezu couldn't help but cut in. His quirk, high-spec, almost demanded to be utilized in the current proceedings. Additionally, the stepmother demands no autopsy be done, and has scheduled for the cremation of the remains, in only a few short hours. His mind working overtime, Izuku quickly came to the same conclusion as the principal. Something wasn't right here. I don't. This isn't. Izuku worked through more pages from the file, paying special attention to the final few that showed Masao's corpse. This isn't a suicide. This picture here shows a face locked in an expression of fear. And these marks on the neck. Are these handprints? That is exactly what we thought, Tsukauchi said with a grim smile. He almost wished the circumstances of their first meeting had been less dire. He'd have offered the boy before him a chance to internship at his department in a heartbeat. What I don't understand, Izuku said, closing the file and handing it back to the detective, is why I'm here. Go-san is already dead. I can't heal that. And regardless of what anyone else thinks, working with the undead doesn't automatically make me an evil genius who'd be able to professionally offer an opinion that would help solve this case. Izuku slumped, at a loss as to why he'd been shown any of this. It was too late for him to do anything. Tae groaned, tugging on his sleeve. What? Izuku flinched back in surprise, voice high. Why would I purposefully turn him into a zombie? Because that's exactly why we've asked you here, Tsukauchi deadpanned, quickly shaking off his own surprise that the green-haired teen before him seemed to be able to understand his undead partner. Izuku, speechless, looked from Nezu to Tsukauchi. Both stared back, resolute in their decision. Tae groaned again, and neither detective nor quirked animal needed a translator to hear the "I told you so" in the sound. If it's trouble with the QRA you're worried about Midoriya-kun, have no fear, Nezu reassured, with my stamp of approval. This will simply become another test of your quirk, to actively attempt to raise an undead. And with an additional recommendation, it can even be a recognized upgrade to your capabilities. Nezu didn't need high spec to know that he was asking a lot from his student. The boy was no doubt still dealing with fallout from the battle trial fiasco, and if he wasn't mistaken, deep-seated self-hatred related to his quirk. I still don't understand. What's the point of making him a zombie? Izuku asked, still baffled. He also felt the stirrings of concern for this boy he'd never met. In the time since quirks have become everyday facets of life, new precedents for many previously impossible to imagine scenarios have been set, Tsukauchi stepped in. One of these is in fact related to how custody of the undead is decided. Izuku shuddered. Hearing the detective speak so clinically about such a topic oddly gave him the creeps. If Go-san were to be raised as an undead by a quirk, custody of his body would fall to the QRA and local police. His stepmother would no longer have any say in its fate, the detective continued undeterred. As head of the CSI division, my jurisdiction includes deciding if newly found zombies require immediate autopsies. This is a precaution in case the cause of death was related to the zombification of the corpse, do you understand? It made sense to Izuku, but that only made him sure that what was being subtly suggested was absolutely illegal and doubly biased. Unfortunately, the only other option was to let a horrendous crime be swept under a rug. As for the QRA, Nezu picked up, seeing Izuku begin to waver in the face of their logic. It actually falls to me as principal of UA to determine the boundaries of my students' quirk examinations. Intellectually speaking, there's no one else better suited to making those types of calls. Nezu, getting into his spiel, hopped up from his chair and strode across his desk. He just couldn't sit still when crafting his masterful plans. However, let's just say, busy as I am, that a tiny mistake is made when signing off on a batch of bodies that were donated to the school for scientific purposes, the quirked animal continued. Lily Hoshikawa is given approval to be used for testing, but which body is hers, and which is that of the cute Masao Go? Looking at pictures of the two, could you blame me for my blunder in differentiating them? Izuku had no doubt that this entire scheme fit into the definition of questionable practice. Even so, it looked like two powerful adults were ready and willing to cover any legal issues for him. Still, something was bothering him. What about Go-san's father? Izuku asked, snapping his fingers. I haven't heard either of you speak about him at all. Why isn't he demanding an autopsy? Nezu ceased his pacing, now staring out into an unfathomable distance. If one looked closely, they would be able to see his paws clenching tightly. Takeo-kun is unreachable, the principal eventually said, forcing a steady tone. I have yet to discover why, but it pains me to think his baby will be cremated while his murder is forgotten due to technicalities. Izuku felt his heart catching in his throat. He didn't know the principal too well, but to see such a vaunted adult react so strongly. "I'll do it," Izuku said, coming to his decision. But under two indisputable conditions. The steel in the green-haired boy's voice caught the adults by surprise. Collecting themselves, the detective and principal nodded, accepting the deal without question. "First, Mr. Go will decide what should be done with Go-san after we're finished. No matter how long it takes to get a hold of him," Izuku said firmly, unwilling to even consider his terms going unmet. "Secondly, I want Tae Yamada's case reopened. Just like Go-san's almost was, her murder was glossed over while the police were busy chasing dead ends. I want her murderer brought to justice so she can rest in peace." To himself, Izuku added an unspoken ambition. He wanted any other girls who'd be suffering wherever Tae did to have a chance at being set free. "You're a special one, Izuku Midoriya," Tsukauchi said. Nodding to Nezu, the detective stuck out a hand to the green-haired teen. "We accept your terms." The two shook hands, both happy with the outcome. "Now, let's get to Recovery Girl," Tsukauchi said, feeling somewhat bad that they were asking so much for so little. "We really don't have much time to do this." Unfortunately for the detective's sense of urgency, the trio didn't even get 2 steps outside the office before encountering their first obstacle. An extremely worried Tsuyu Asui. Able to mentally multitask thanks to his quirk, Nezu took a second to make a mental note regarding the bonds of friendship the promising student standing next to him was already forging. He found a fulfilling delight in witnessing the green-haired teen's utter lack of concern for things such as social status or quirk hierarchy. He wouldn't have been surprised if someone else in Midoriya's situation had tried for another student with higher status, such as the Yaoyorozu girl who'd been admitted through a recommendation, but here was proof of the opposite having occurred. Izuku-san, is everything alright?" Tsuyu asked in obvious worry. Izuku couldn't help the smile that pulled at him. Seeing the frog girl's completely normal, beautiful black eyes let him know that her worry was genuine. "Everything's fine. It's just that the detective here needs help from someone with a quirk like mine," Izuku reassured. "You should get back to class soon. Keep Tokiyami from going off on Mina again." Nezu had been the principal of UA for years now, and he wasn't fooled for a second witnessing the interaction between the two green teens before him. If Midoriya hadn't just sounded like a caring boyfriend, he'd reveal just what kind of animal he was. And had Asui almost used an endearing nickname for the boy? Tsuyu nodded at Izuku's words, reluctantly turning to leave. Catching the eye of the man in the trench coat, she stared unblinkingly at him. She was going to memorize his face should something happen to her friend, just in case. Besides, he still owed her. The trek to Recovery Girl's office passed in relative silence. Tsukauchi eyed Tae whenever the zombie girl let out a groan. Izuku thought over as many possible problems that could come from participating in this ploy. Nezu focused on how close they were to taking a step toward helping his old friend's child find justice. Nurse's office. "Ah, so they managed to convince you," Recovery Girl greeted as the quartet entered. She chuckled at a stray thought. "With as much time as you're beginning to spend here, people will begin to think you like hospital work." Tae, the last one to enter, closed the door behind her, completely ignoring the sign that declared the office temporarily closed. Izuku, grateful for an attempt at banter to relax the tense situation, ruefully scratched the back of his head. "Yeah, no," the green-haired teen replied, "I'm sorry, but I don't think I'll ever like hospitals." "Is everything ready?" Nezu asked, standing as close to the room's single large window as possible. Determined to fight for justice or not, the quirked animal knew if he had to get any closer to Recovery Girl's examination tables his PTSD would likely be set off. Midoriya wasn't the only one who hated hospitals. Of course, and as unfortunate as the need for it has been over the years, I'm still qualified to act as a coroner in situations like this, Recovery Girl said, happily pulling out some last-minute pieces of equipment. Go-san is on the table behind the curtain here, and I've got my cameras all ready to record. No cameras. The shout came 3 times over, shocking the elderly heroine. She'd learned enough about Midoriya to anticipate his reticence, but Nezu or Tsukauchi's. "What? Why ever not?" Recovery Girl questioned, unsure as to what was happening. There is a great deal that is about to happen in this room, Nezu answered, eyeing his school's nurse. And much of it will not leave it. If you must, think of it as a personal favor. Fine, Recovery Girl conceded, laying the cameras she'd been holding on a nearby desk. However, you will be allowing me to record this event the next time. Next time? Izuku asked, distraught. He didn't like the pro-heroine's tone at all. I had hoped to be able to discuss this later, Midoriya-kun, but the short of it is that the QRA has allowed for you to create more zombies so long as it's under our supervision, Nezu quickly filled in, hoping to lose as little time as possible. There is great curiosity regarding Tae-chan's existence and the rather unique capabilities your Quirk has granted her. Impatient to get started, Recovery Girl pulled back the curtain from the single exam table that had been blocked off from the rest of the room. Izuku was quick to notice the body revealed, its face frozen in heartbreaking pain and fear. That wasn't the worst of it, however, not by a long shot. The body of Masao Go was littered with marks, bruises of all colors and sizes. Seeing it in person, it was obvious the history of the boy was a dark one. He'd been the victim of a terrible crime. Taking it in, Izuku felt his determination catch fire. He was going to do everything in his power to find justice for this tragedy. Getting closer, the green-haired teen noticed, to his dread, a smell he wished wasn't so familiar. Tae's low growl only confirmed his fear. The threatening sound also caused Tsukauchi and Recovery Girl to step back in fright. I need a syringe, 10 milliliters, Izuku said, now standing by over the naked body. And clothes. He'll need some clothes. Here, Recovery Girl said, pulling the requested syringe from a cabinet. She had to suppress her eagerness lest she frighten the boy. Let me help you with. I'll do it myself. Izuku cut the pro-heroine off, grabbing the syringe from her hands. The teen's sudden coldness was disturbing to those present, but the now growling Tae, whose glare directed at Recovery Girl spoke of distrust to the extreme, quieted any thoughts of complaining. Tsukauchi had seen a lot during his tenure upholding the law, but even he had to admit to himself that seeing a high schooler plunge a needle into his own arm, with practiced ease no less, without flinching unsettled him. To his experienced eye, it appeared like Midoriya had done such an action before, hundreds of times. And not only to himself it seemed, for without pausing, the teen took the now full syringe, found a vein on the corpse's arm, and started injecting his blood into it. Now, go. Go in deep, and travel far. Restore this broken avatar, Izuku intoned, in righteous fury, justice sought. Let not the truth be left to rot. The watching adults were unsure of how to react to seeing the green-haired teen before them, chanting, as he repeated the process of injecting his blood into the corpse of Masao Go 3 more times. Noticing she was standing behind her two enraptured peers, Recovery Girl stealthily activated her cameras. She wouldn't be denied the opportunity to properly study the zombification process in action. When the final injection was completed, Izuku stood back, limiting his actions to staring at the body and lowly muttering at it to rise. There was nothing else to do now but wait. A minute passed, no movement. 2 more minutes passed. Masao Go was still as unmoving in death as ever. After 7 more minutes of nothing, Tsukauchi decided that their attempt had been a failure. He hated to say it, but it looked like Midoriya's Quirk must have had a fluke and there'd be no justice for the child. Just as the detective had taken the sheet that had covered Masao Go's corpse to recover its face, the body shuddered. Suddenly, glowing red eyes snapped open. Tsukauchi jumped back in surprise. In a move seen in any cult classic horror movie, the corpse sat straight up. Slowly, the newly reanimated zombie turned its gaze around the room, opened its mouth and... Pappy, the zombified Masao asked, clearly disoriented and scared. Where's Pappy? What? Izuku gasped, more disoriented than the kid on the table. How is, what? The unexpected development struck the adults in the room slightly differently. Tsukauchi found himself pressed as hard as he could be against the farthest wall from the newborn zombie, unable to get a handle on his body's reaction to the unnatural wrongness before him. Nezu was too shocked to react. Never had he expected Midoriya's Quirk could be so strong as to bring a victim back to full cognizance. Recovery Girl, the consummate professional she prided herself in being, leapt forward into action. There's still no pulse, the pro-heroine said, pressing a stethoscope into a chest that didn't rise or fall. And there's no evidence of breathing either. By all accounts, this body is still clinically dead. Where am I? Why am I naked again? Masao asked, becoming agitated as more cognitive function returned. I do not want pizza and hot dogs anymore. I wanna go home. Tsukauchi felt his blood freeze, and not because a newly created zombie was somehow self-aware enough to lose its temper. He'd heard that phrase before. Pizza and hot dogs, slang for a group of high-profile pedophiles throwing a party where the menu included children. It was truly despicable, but this opened up so many possibilities. If dead witnesses could now give testimonies on who killed them, criminals would have one less way of evading punishment for their crimes. Izuku wasn't quite sure what the latest recipient of his quirk's power was talking about, but he knew he needed to do something. Whatever Go-san was remembering, it was clearly traumatic. Moving before he could really think, the green-haired teen hugged the distressed child, beginning to rock back and forth. Nezu was shaking, in rage. Just what the hell had that bitch involved his friend's precious child in? He thought he'd been angry when he'd first heard about Masao-kun's death. That was nothing to what was reverberating through his small frame now. Recovery Girl couldn't believe her luck. With Midoriya's quirk she could change everything. She'd be immortalized as the one who discovered how to conquer death and bring back the great heroes of old. She could hardly contain herself. It's okay. I promise, Izuku soothed. No one's gonna hurt you anymore, or ever again. The green-haired teen's kind words were contrasted by the suddenly harsh glare he directed at the adults. Didn't I ask for clothes? Realizing they'd completely become mired in their own thoughts, Tsukauchi and Nezu jumped to grab anything at all to help the kid's modesty, undead or not. While the two adults were scrambling, the newly zombified child was beginning to calm down. The scent in the air was familiar, comforting, like family. The green-haired teen, he felt trustworthy. He wasn't going to hurt him, not like those old men. There was this feeling, like he was someone worth being around, doing things for. In the span of a few minutes, a tire had been found, a hospital gown that was 2 sizes too large. The exam table had been turned into a debrief desk with Tsukauchi on one side and Izuku and the zombies on the other. Recovery Girl in the meantime had managed to surreptitiously place her cameras at all angles around the room. Okay now, Masao-san. Lily. I am Lily. The newborn zombie interrupted Tsukauchi while pouting, apparently still irate at being seen naked. Only Pappy can call me that. Lily. Izuku asked, slightly confused, like Lily Hoshikawa. The zombie child nodded emphatically in response. Yes, that's me. Lily is the prettiest girl on TV. Lily shouted happily, obvious pride shining. Lily brings happiness to everyone. Oh, Izuku said, realizing what was going on. I see. Of course, right. Lily is a girl. The green-haired teen was surprised to discover that the up-and-coming idol's cross-dressing alias was actually the identity Masa. Lily felt was the better fit. But it was almost the 24th century and he was well aware that some people were simply just born in the wrong body sometimes. Nezu. Tsukauchi turned to the principal of UA curtly. His now piercing gaze all but demanding to know why he wasn't informed about this particular facet of their victim. Oh, don't blame me, detective, Nezu defended. I haven't seen Lily here since she was a baby. How would I have known? Brushing off the defense, the detective turned back to Lily, cross-face instantly smoothing back to his professional interrogator visage. Anyway, Lily, could you tell us what the last thing you remember is? He'd have loved to press the quirked animal for not knowing something for once. The opportunity came once in a blue moon after all, but he had to hurry. No one knew how long this seemingly stronger effect of Midoriya's quirk would last. Instead of answering, Lily bowed her head, hiding behind her blue bangs. Izuku, noticing the apprehension radiating off the hunched zombie, gently laid a comforting hand on her shoulder. It's okay. Tell him everything, the hero in training said, hoping to project calm. We need to know so that the people who hurt you can be punished. Swallowing thickly, and wasn't that a slight surprise to those who didn't think a zombie could get nervous, Lily nodded. Raising her head, she locked her slightly glowing red eyes to Tsukauchi's black. Lily's new mom said we were going for pizza and hot dogs, the little girl began slowly, to celebrate Lily's placement on the TV show. That phrase again. Izuku noticed how Tsukauchi stiffened again as the words left Lily's mouth. Any question he had about it being worse than it appeared was definitely gone now. The detective, indeed now rigid, was itching for his notepad. It looked like there was no question now, the stepmother was a willing participant in this monstrosity. But Lily didn't get pizza or hot dogs, the zombie girl continued, unbidden. Stepmom brought Lily to a shiny place filled with old men instead. Old men and other kids. Red eyes filled with tears and shoulders shaking, Lily endured, unable to stop. The greasy old men. They stuck things in Lily's butt, the tears were falling now, and sobs racked the small zombie's frame, but she pushed on. They always hurt too, always burned. But the old men laughed no matter how much Lily cried. They laughed before grabbing Lily's face and prying her mouth open to put in there. Izuku, feeling queasy, softly put his hand over Lily's mouth, silencing the horrible picture. He thought he'd be able to handle hearing what had happened, he'd seen the pictures. But this was worse than a nightmare. Then he realized, it was almost like TAE all over again. Enough, that's enough, Izuku choked out, reaching down to hug the quietly sobbing little girl. Tsukauchi-san, surely you don't need to hear anything more at the moment. No, of course not. The detective was quick to agree. Seeing a child cry was always heartbreaking, but a dead child. There were no words. Lily, if I show you pictures of lots of men, do you think you could pick out those that hurt you? Or, even better, anyone you saw in the shiny room at all? Peeking out from under Izuku, the tearful child gave a shy nod. We can still do the autopsy, recovery girl suddenly offered to the silent room. The tactless proposal earned a glare from the green-haired boy before her, and a truly menacing growl from the other zombie in the room. Or, we can just use my scanners, the pro-heroine meekly tried in the face of brutal murder. Although, even her other tools would be acceptable to study this new breed of zombie. She didn't think she'd ever heard of a report on an awakened undead before. As Izuku held Lily in his arms, he couldn't help but look at TAE in wonder. Why hadn't she awoken, after all this time? Or was the better question, why had Lily woken up? He was sure of one thing though, he'd once again just opened a massive can of worms. He needed a coffee or something, anything to help him think of a way out of all the trouble he just knew was coming. Tsuyu started her day, oddly enough, on both the wrong and right foot. When she'd finally managed to shake away the last vestiges of sleep, she realized that her tongue no longer remembered Izuku's taste, her nose no longer sharp enough to pinpoint his location. A mad dash to her bathroom's mirror revealed a black-eyed reflection, the long-awaited sign her savior's blood no longer pulsed inside her, influenced her. The rules no longer apply. She'd be able to touch him this morning. As this thought blazed through her mind, Tsuyu came to another revelation. Her feelings for the green-haired teen were indeed the real deal. Unfortunately, the elation that wanted to bubble up from her stomach was summarily soured by memories of how much she'd suffered at the hands of Izuku's rules. She didn't know what she wanted to do now. Any doubts the frog girl might have had about being returned to her old self died when her savior arrived at her family's home to walk her to school. Memories of her actions under the influence of his blood, the trouble she'd caused, flooded her mind immediately upon seeing him, and her self-consciousness struck full force. How was she supposed to greet him now? Conflicting feelings battled within her, and the decision to remain silent was made in a split second. Stewing in her uncertainty, Tsuyu avoided eye contact for the entire trip to school. When Izuku was called to the principal's office, however, she knew she was a lost cause. Watching the green-haired teen walk away caused her to be consumed with guilt. It'd be all her fault if he was suspended or expelled, since she'd been unable to keep his control ability secret. She'd ended up following Izuku for a hodgepodge of reasons, regardless of President Mike's warnings, earning her first detention in her entire life. "Hey Asui-san, are you alright?" Jiro asked the distraught frog girl across from her, leaning forward to speak around the red-haired Kirishima. The groan of exasperation wasn't an encouraging sign. "Not really, Hiro," Tsuyu replied, slumping further into her desk. Waiting for Izuku to return to the classroom, all smiles to prove everything had turned out fine, was torture. She was so going to punish him for getting her into trouble now, maybe demand he stay with her for the entire detention. Is detention that bad? Ochako asked, barely able to remember her last detention from back in elementary school. A prank gone wrong had cost her a whole evening, but it had been more boring than anything. Not even her parents had been angry with her at the time. Suyu didn't answer. The problem wasn't the detention, or the fuss her mother would no doubt make about it. She was more concerned about that detective she'd seen and how long it was taking Izuku to come back. There was only an hour before lunch. Present Mike had left forever ago, but there was still no hint of the green-haired teen. She was beginning to suspect that the selfless idiot had tricked her, sacrificing himself to whatever horrors the policeman could think of in order to protect the rest of the student body from his nefarious influence. Asui-san, you are worrying for Midoriya, correct? Tokiyami asked eventually. The raven-headed teen had nailed it on the head. Maybe he's just being questioned. You know, about his morals, Ojiro butted into the conversation, unable to remain a neutral party. I mean, think about it. He didn't do anything bad to Asui-san, sure, but he had her under his complete control. While the tailed boy didn't have anything personal against his green-haired classmate, the cunning mind he'd shown and his aberrant quirk gave him the creeps. The powers Midoriya had shown weren't ones he was keen to see grow. Hey, maybe he was asked to keep a villain under control. Mina threw out, quick to jump in. It was clear to those involved from her excited voice that the pink-skinned girl was more intent on derailing conversation than helping, though. You infer he's been involved in an interrogation? Iida questioned, ever serious. Mina frowned, her attempt at a prank setup hijacked by the academic. I for one can see such a thing working for the benefit of all. The floating uniform that was the only indication of where Toru was standing shifted, the invisible girl making some unseen movement. It was still expressive enough to draw the attention of those gathered. Wouldn't that be considered a coerced confession? Toru asked shyly, still slightly put off by Izuku and his quirk. She agreed that he seemed like a nice enough person, but the idea of his blood getting into her and becoming in BPD still haunted her dreams sometimes. I wouldn't think so, Momo interjected, ready to do her best to defend her vice president. From what I could understand from watching Su-chan, the commands are more undeniable compulsions. An order to answer truthfully isn't impacting the responses given, only forcing them out. The police would be able to proceed with questioning without interference. Is that right, Su-chan? The mature girl might have found the idea of blood transference revolting, but that was more to do with her slight hemophobia than any issue with her green-haired vice. Izuku had shown himself to be quite the responsible and capable person. His handling of Suyu's incapacitation only further proved his morality in her eyes. It's true, disobeying his commands is impossible. No matter how much I tried, I just couldn't, Suyu replied monotonously. If she hadn't been so distracted by her worries, she might have watched what her mouth was saying. But he was too kind about it. Seeing another opportunity for teasing appear before her, Mina jumped on the slip as quickly as she could. Wait, are you disappointed that he didn't order anything kinky? The pink-skinned girl asked, a large badgering smile on her face. Conspiratorially, she nudged Toru, hoping her usual partner in crime would catch on and help her out. Suyu fought the urge to reply. Silence was better for her than any possible answer she could give Mina's suggestive question. From the looks her classmates were trading back and forth, many seemed to agree with her. It was easy to see that many, regardless of how they felt about his quirk, considered Izuku too nice to do something like that. Others, from the pinched looks they held, were clearly of the opinion the prying was in bad taste. Oh man, the things I could do with a quirk like that. The nasally voice of 1A's resident pervert railroaded into the gathered classmates, earning the midget glares of derision from nearly all present. Yeah, the ladies would be easier to please with what Midoriya's packing, Hontashiro, a teen with a sharp chin and cylindrical elbows, added with a suggestive wink. It'd be easier to get away with a lower budget date, am I right? Kaminari joined in, earning his own death glares from the girls. A quick double slap and an ear jack to the eye later, and the three boys were hunched over cradling their newest reminders to not piss off their female classmates. Sometimes it seemed like they didn't take their education seriously at all. But seriously, Su-chan, Ochako pushed, as Midoriya a cheap boyfriend. We're not dating, Suyu grit out vehemently. The frog girl hoped her curt answer hid her disappointment while also conveying she wouldn't be against such a thing occurring. Clasped hands and a hopeful look joined the rosy-cheeked brunette's now sparkling eyes. Suyu felt her stomach begin to turn knots. Really? Then, do you think he'd want to be one? Ochako's question nailed one of the fears the frog girl had developed while under Izuku's control. Other girls would eventually discover the boy's disposition and move in on her territory. While her classmates sat embroiled in her inner turmoil, Ochako was involved in her own mental gymnastics. It was beyond any shred of doubt now that Izuku Midoriya was a great guy, nice, and considerate toward everyone. It was easy to see him as boyfriend material after everything that had happened. If she could just get him to get rid of the reanimated corpse, she'd be able to get along fabulously with the green-haired boy. After all, with a quirk like his, there was tons of money in his future. Suyu could see the machinations brewing in the brunette's eyes, and they just made her want to slap the girl really hard, and make it clear she'd seen green-haired teen first. She may have still had a ton of her own obstacles to clear first, finishing her education, forcing Izuku to forgive his unwitting use of control on her, finding the courage to assert her feelings, and all the paperwork she knew their mothers were no doubt writing up, but she didn't need challengers on top of all that. Realizing she'd begun a clear list of checkmarks in regards to living a life with Izuku, Suyu considered the idea that she'd been thinking too far ahead, but then she couldn't let just anyone else weasel their way to him first. It was enough to make her head spin. The classroom door opened. Man, that took way too long. I'm starving. Izuku's shout startled everyone present, his entrance sudden. Walking into the room, followed by Tae, the green-haired teen held the door open, a manila folder in one hand. I'm sorry for causing you so much trouble, Oni-chan, came an innocent apology from the lips of a little girl as she entered behind the previously missing 1A members, dressed in a school's PE uniform that was too large for her. The child looked a bit pale, but was otherwise full of energy, her long, light blue hair bouncing in large twintails. The green-haired teen had hardly closed the door behind the little girl before he found his hands full of concerned frog girl. Izu-kun, Hiro. Suyu's soft question left little doubt to the observing classmates as to where her feelings lied. Quick to snap out of his shock at Suyu's full-body tackle, Izuku wrapped one arm around the person who'd come to mean so much to him in such a short amount of time, his other reaching up to scratch the back of his head. Oh, hee, sorry for taking so long, the green-haired teen said, I ran into unforeseen circumstances. As long as you're fine, there's nothing to apologize for, Hiro, Suyu countered, sagging with relief when she saw his clear eyes devoid of any withheld secrets. He really was okay. But there were still questions to be answered though, namely concerning the little girl that had just claimed him as her brother. Is she your girlfriend? That is, if the little girl didn't beat them all to the punch. With the innocent cruelty only the naivety of youth could produce, the blue-haired child threw Suyu right back into the mental conundrum of her undefined relationship with her savior. Needless to say, she could hardly control the blush that spread across her face, much to the sniggered enjoyment of her classmates. Lily-chan, that's impolite, Izuku blurted out, not confirming or denying the question. Sorry about that, she's a curious one. As the green-haired hero in training tried to wave away Lily's inquisitiveness, Suyu felt the beginnings of suspicion sprout in her mind. She knew Izuku had no siblings, and a quick taste of the air confirmed that the little girl was wearing the same perfume Tae did, only in a stronger concentration. What just about clenched it for her though, was that the little girl's eyes were red. Don't worry, I understand, Suyu said, forcing her usual monotone. She doubted Izuku would appreciate attention being drawn to the fact he'd probably just used his quirk again. But she had to ask, but more importantly, who is? That's Lily Hoshikawa, the child prodigy that's rumored to be appearing on the upcoming Clash of the Idols TV show. It wasn't that one of 1A's members besides Izuku knew the identity of the girl that caused those present to stare in wide-eyed shock at the announcement. It wasn't the near fanaticism the freak out was delivered with that drew everyone up short either. No, it was the fact that it was Minoru Mineta of all people who had screamed the information that left the room speechless. Lily, happy to be recognized, spun around and launched into a cute pose. Ah, a fan. The little idol hopeful was filled with glee that she was already seeing a bit of the fame she'd worked so hard to gain. Almost immediately, that joy fell away when the loud, short boy began drooling and muttering. Such delicate features, such a perfect build, Mineta rambled, fingers twitching towards the now backpedaling Lily. The upcoming swimsuit pics are gonna be the best in forever, and in a few years, the Ling. The miniature pervert's depravity was cut short by a solid eraser shot to the head, courtesy of a glaring Izuku. Oddly enough, even though the assault had been committed in full view of all present, not a soul decided to reprimand the green-haired teen for his actions. Unfortunately, the damage had been done. Lily, spooked, had retreated behind her new big brother, clutching onto his pants leg tightly. With her face buried into his back, no one could see the panic that the midget's words had induced. "Aizu ni, I don't think I want to be an idol anymore," Lily whispered, pulling slightly on Izuku's clothes to get him to bend down to her level. Not with people like him, like the old men, still around. Heart aching once again for the horrors the little girl before him had been forced to endure, Izuku gave the slightly trembling Lily a reassuring head pat followed by a warm, lovely smile. "Don't worry, Lily-chan. I'll keep you safe," Izuku comforted, "and if people like him cause you problems when I'm not around, Tae-chan will gladly take care of them for you. Isn't that right?" Turning to the older zombie girl, the two were given a resolute grunt from the Ravenet. Delighted, the child idol gave a beaming smile in return. Enchanted by Lily's happiness, the girls of 1A slowly swarmed the little girl who, instead of being overwhelmed, seemed to thoroughly enjoy the numerous head pats she was given. Recognizing the brunette's sparkly red eyes for the sign they were, the older girls silently agreed to give their classmate the benefit of the doubt this time. To them, Izuku had just been hired to heal the little girl and this was a temporary result, nothing worse. Then Aizawa finally entered the classroom. "Everyone, sit down." The instruction was met with absolute obedience, except for one student. Glancing up, the gruff teacher saw that one of his favorite trouble children was still standing, no doubt ready to cause another headache and deluge of paperwork. "Midoriya," Aizawa groused, feeling conflicted on whether or not he wanted his class's vice president to have an excuse to still be standing. Narrowing his eyes, the underground hero noticed a new face in his classroom standing beside the green-haired teen, a little girl that seemed oddly familiar. "Sensei, this is for you," Izuku answered, bowing before handing over the manila folder he'd been holding. In a wholly illegal act of cuteness, the little girl quickly imitated the boy's strict posture. "It's regarding an upgrade to my quirk. I apologize for any inconvenience this causes." Waving Izuku back to his desk, Aizawa gave the contents of the folder a cursory glance. The front documents covered quite the disturbing bit of information. No matter how much he agreed that students needed to experiment and study their quirks, there was just something seemingly wrong with zombifying a child. In an act of rarely seen emotion, Aizawa nearly dropped the folder when he scanned the newly created zombie's name and cause of death. As it was, the gruff man visibly paled as he finally remembered the name, and the person it belonged to. Feeling sick, a weight settled in his stomach as he read the cause of death and reason for zombification. Flashback. It was a month ago, and he'd been unavoidably drafted into attending some ridiculous contest that was being used to select the main protagonist of some upcoming TV show. Thankfully, he didn't have to suffer being a judge, just represent the token hero presence the general populace had grown used to seeing at such events. He'd been pissed, he remembered, since the job had originally been handed to Midnight. Whatever indisposition the somnambulist user had excused herself with though, whether or not the true reason was one too many drinks the previous night or miraculously breaking her growing dry streak, it had been enough to get Nezu to select him to go in her place. He'd hated every minute of that day, and he hadn't bothered to hide that fact either. That's probably why all the child contestants had given him plenty of space and kept quiet whenever he was present. All except for one. "Mister, are you really a hero?" the little had asked, getting way too close for his comfort. Apparently his less than friendly appearance hadn't frightened everyone away. Pity. "Yeah, I am," he'd answered as dryly as possible. He'd hoped that where looks might have failed, perhaps attitude would do the trick against the bundle of joy. "I don't think I've seen you before," the little girl had responded instead, smiling bright enough to rival All Might in cheerfulness and luminosity. "What's your name?" He couldn't figure out what had been wrong with the girl. He was an underground hero, unsung by the masses, and worked to hunt down villains where other heroes feared to tread. He wasn't a social person by any means. Why was she bugging him? "Eraserhead," had been his eventual one-word answer. Again, instead of being off-put by his countenance, the little girl had clapped her hands at the name. "That's a cool name. My name's Lily. It was nice to meet you, Mr. Eraserhead." Standing there, Aizawa had been confused as to what he'd done next. The little girl, Lily, had succeeded in getting a handshake from him, the underground hero that never gave interviews or allowed the spotlight to fall on him. Suddenly Lily's name had been called. It was her turn to appear on stage. "It's time. Cheer for Lily today, and Lily will cheer for you on TV." The little girl had seamlessly slipped into an even more perky and bubbly personality. She hadn't moved, however, obviously expecting him to cheer her on. "He didn't do cheering. You go and do your part," he'd answered instead, "and I'll always keep you safe." The sparkling eyes and innocent smile he'd received in return had been dangerously close to making him feel something. The performance had been beautiful and perfect, at least as far as Aizawa knew how to judge such things. Lily's motions had been fluid, natural, and joyful, and her victory was undisputed. Unable to help himself, the gruff hero had found himself applauding the brunette's act. But only a little. Aware the girl had been getting to him despite his best efforts, Aizawa had made an effort to leave the venue, as soon as he was able, without Lily noticing. That had been the last time he'd seen her. Alive, equals flashback, end equals. Snapping out his memories, Aizawa stumbled back, dropping the folder onto his desk. I just remembered I have to go to the faculty office for something," the normally composed teacher said, holding onto his professional visage as hard as he could. "Take this period for self-study." With that, he left the classroom, head down, without a backwards glance. "Lily might have seen that guy from somewhere before," Lily mumbled, tilting her head to the side as soon as she felt it was proper to do so. "Do you think he left because of Lily?" "Midoriya, just what did you mean by upgrade?" Iida yelled out, arm chopping the air like mad. The bespectacled student, forgetting what the class had just been told, was worried by what such terminology might suggest. He truly hoped the sweet little girl before them wasn't being referred to as such. He didn't know how he'd be able to accept it if the prestigious UA allowed for the enthralling of a child into a tool for hero training. "Yeah, you're not going to tell us they're allowing you to keep beeps now, are you?" Ojiro spat, slamming his hands onto his desk as he shot to his feet. The tailed boy was beyond upset. Seeing a reanimated corpse being forced to do the green-haired teen's work for him was one thing, but this was a whole other level of worse. In no time at all, the room was a cacophony of voices all plying to be heard. Izuku was frozen, shocked by how badly things had devolved so quickly. In a matter of moments his already damaged reputation was beginning to sink even further, and he feared the few friends he had would soon abandon him for good. Unnoticed by the fretting green-haired teen, Tae had placed herself squarely between him and his classmates, baring her teeth with a low growl. Even Lily, small as she was, had instinctively taken a step away from the crowd and gone to hug his leg to offer her support. "Just let him explain. Cease your baseless accusations." The stereo shouts from Jiro and Tokiyami respectively cut through the chaos, the former jumping to stand on her desk while the latter had used dark shadow to make himself appear more imposing. Suyu, too enraged at their stupidity to even speak to her classmates, had risen to stand next to Tae, glaring harshly at the few who could meet her eye. Instantly, the competing voices quieted, making Izuku feel beyond blessed to have such wonderful friends. He made a mental note to remember to ask Jiro later if she actually wanted to be his friend though. Oh, thanks you guys. I'll make this quick though, Izuku said, incredibly uncomfortable when all eyes landed on him expectantly. You know what? Better yet, Lily, why don't you introduce yourself? The words caused the little girl to begin bouncing in place, her happiness at being given the spotlight obvious. Slipping into a cute pose, the brunette began her introduction. Hello everyone, I'm Lily. Lily's the prettiest girl in the whole idol world. Lily presented in a sing-song voice, dipping and spinning like she was on stage. After a cute wink with a smooch to her audience, she gave a gracious bow. But now that Lily is dead, Lily will fight beside her hero Izuni. You can count on Lily. Silence. The members of 1A needed a moment to process what they'd just seen and heard. Did Le Petit Magnane just say? Yuga Aoyama, his hands split between holding his massive belt against his churning stomach and covering his mouth, couldn't bear to finish his question. The blonde wanted with all his might to be able to disbelieve that he and his class had a dead child before them, hoping that refusing to speak the terrible truth would somehow undo it. Why? Momo choked out, the class president's mind reeling from facing the cruel fact spitting her in the face. The enquiry was followed by one of the mature young woman's fists being slammed onto her desktop. What happened to her? Lily recoiled, more from the question than Momo's aggressive emotional outlet. After a brief moment where it looked like the brunette was fighting some internal battle, she turned to stare back at Izuku, a silent pleading in her red eyes. Lily doesn't have to answer that, does she? Izuku, himself glad to be able to skip reliving the horrors of Lily's fate, was quick to reassure the young zombie with another head pat and one of his best smiles. Of course not, Lily-chan, the green-haired teen said, you've told them plenty. While the brunette visibly relaxed at his kind words, Izuku's classmates all paled at the knowledge that such an innocent-looking little girl had gone through something so disturbing and upsetting that she actively chose not to remember it. Many of them could only conceive of a handful of scenarios that they felt fit that bill, and all of them were incredibly sickening to consider. Left embroiled in their imaginations, the rest of the class sat by as one of their number stood from her desk and walked over to Lily. Surprised that she'd have to be the one to bring up the oddity she'd noticed, Jiro knelt in front of the little brunette, gazed into her ruby eyes, checked her pulse, nodded once, and decided it was officially all right to ask about what had been bothering her. So Lily's a zombie, that can talk, why? As self-tortuous as the rest of 1A were being at the moment with their thoughts, the clear voice of their musically inclined classmate was enough to snap them back to reality. Like heat-seeking missiles, sharp inquisitive looks were thrown Izuku's way. Once again, he'd landed in the spotlight. That's kinda the upgrade. The green-haired teen tried to begin an answer, only to be immediately drowned out by the ensuing uproar once again. Halls, under a staircase. Shota Aizawa was drowning, curled up in a ball in a spot he'd found back in his days as a student where no one would bother him. The normally indifferent man was facing a crisis. His worst nightmare had become a reality. He'd made a heroic promise and failed to uphold it. And worse still, the victim of his inadequacy had returned from the dead to torment him. Shota-kun, what are you doing here? So much for his spot. Hearing Midnight's voice but choosing to wallow instead of answer, Aizawa continued to sit in his ball, unmoving. What's with you? Midnight continued to prod, sashaying closer to the small space her coworker had holed up in. You see a ghost. Upon getting closer, the 18-plus only heroine sobered up instantly. Whatever could put tear tracks down the face of the hardened underground hero Eraserhead was no laughing matter. What would you do if someone you failed to save suddenly appeared right in front of you? Aizawa eventually asked, a haunted note to his gravelly voice. Midnight leaned back in a contemplative pose, a perfectly manicured hand raising up to cup her chin in thought while the other arm crossed her S to support her elbow. She'd seen Nezu do this pose 1,000 times and this situation obviously called for serious smarts. I'd say it'd depend on how hard of a failure we're talking about, the heroine ultimately replied after a few moments of silence. Without further, or any, invitation, Midnight sat beside her coworker, doing her best to project empathy. I promised to save her, and instead this little girl died at the hands of a group of repulsive degenerates. Aizawa forced the words out, palming his face in his hands. She just walked into my classroom as a zombie, by the way. Midnight's complexion paled to match that of the suffering man beside her. The heroine well knew that while such failures were more common, though underreported, occurrences than realized in today's society, they were also the ones that hurt the most. She couldn't believe the shit luck her coworker had just rolled. It looked like even being warned about their students' quirks wasn't enough anymore. If it were me, Midnight said, a feral grin curling across her full lips, I'd probably find a nice secluded corner to cry in, and then I'd go on a bloody crusade and not stop until I'd made all those damn perverts eat their own dicks. It was a ludicrous statement, of course. They were pro-heroes, not vigilantes. That kind of action was beyond the purview of all but the most underground and black-marked of heroes. But the buxom woman was trying to get a reaction from her despondent coworker, a laugh, a reprimand, anything. Seeing the vicious glare form in the eyes of the man beside her, she felt victorious. That's not a bad idea, Aizawa grumbled as he stood up, a look of stony determination settling on his features. Midnight was taken aback by the terrifying look. She hadn't expected him to take her seriously. Pulling himself together, the formerly depressed man began to walk away. Only a few steps away, he stopped. Thanks for listening. I feel better, Aizawa said, glancing back briefly at the stunned woman behind him. He had a new goal, for the first time in too many years to count. He just hoped Nezu would agree to allow him some additional hero work hours in the near future. Why am I suddenly feeling guilty? Midnight's words fell on deaf ears, the hall now empty. Sliding to her feet and resuming her walk, the 18-plus heroine hoped. She hoped that the return of a long-buried fear of her dear friend falling into villainy was just a trick of her imagination. Back in Class 1A. After more discussion, shouting, counter-shouting, and calmer minds ultimately prevailing, things had thankfully wound down. For the first time since arriving in the classroom, it felt like Izuku had finally found some room to breathe while everyone else was preoccupied. In one corner, the girl, consisting of Momo, Toru, Mina, and Ochako, took turns playing with Lily and brushing her luscious hair. Others like Todoroki and Kirishima watched the undead girl from the sidelines, the sadness weighing their gazes a clear indication they found her existence hard to accept. Koji Koda, the boy with the boulder-like head and whispery voice, and others like him put more effort into ignoring the elephant in the room, the actual crimes that had been committed against a child like Lily. Then, there were the likes of Ojiro and Mineta, who for their own reasons were against the existence of another undead in the classroom. TAE was in perfect form, acting as an excellent deterrent to any actions they might have taken though. I'm sorry, Su-chan, Izuku apologized once again. He blamed the fact that his dear friend had earned detention on himself naturally. Don't be, Suyu countered, doing her best to reduce her friend's feelings of guilt. It was my choice and no one else's. It's not your blame to carry. Had it not been for Lily keeping the other girls fully distracted, the frog girl knew she and Izuku would be getting the third degree for how close they'd become while speaking. The green-haired boy seemed way too worried about her. Still, I wish there was something I could do to make up for the trouble. Suyu so didn't need her friend's kicked puppy dog eyes right now. But if he was adamant about offering, she wasn't above taking advantage. She had just the thing too. Fine, if you insist, Suyu said, acting as if she'd given in. Why don't you help me with the chemistry work I missed while too distracted by your blood? Now, when Izuku realized he couldn't help her with the assignments, he'd been in a worse headspace than her. She'd have a legitimate reason to keep their close contact going without looking desperate. It was the perfect way to make sure she'd get to spend more time with him. Any minute he'd stutter out an Apollo. Sure, what lessons were you having problems with? The green-haired teen asked, pulling out his textbook. Suyu frowned. He'd answered without a second of hesitation. Almost as if, weren't you too upset to focus the last few days? The frog girl ventured to ask, hiding her disappointment with forced curiosity. Izuku didn't look away from the pages he was fumbling through, busy checking a few of his personal notes, when he answered. I was, but I've already finished the book, so this shouldn't be a problem. whatever else he'd meant to say was lost to a storm of mumbling. "You finished the whole textbook, already?" Suyu's incredulity temporarily usurped her usual monotone. Unfortunately, Izuku took the tonal change for one of criticism. Years spent as a victim of similar condemnation had left the green-haired teen with the disposition to avoid acknowledging his intelligence. So in true Midoriya form, he tried to cover for his accidental slip. "I was bored," Izuku weakly replied, instantly knowing such an answer was too stupid to pass muster with his friend. Suyu looked from the now sweating teen in front of her to the backpack at his feet, just now remembering that at least half of the notebooks in said pack were filled with Quirk and hero analyses. And he had many more just like them that he didn't have the space to keep with him at all times. It suddenly clicked to the frog girl that the sweet boy before her had a truly brilliant mind. "Izu-kun, is there a book on any of the syllabi for any of our classes that you haven't finished yet?" Suyu asked with slight apprehension. The green-haired teen stopped his page turning, considering the question. He snapped his fingers a second later. "Art history," Izuku said. I just can't understand it at all." Suyu facepalmed. How was she supposed to deal with this cinnamon roll without feeling like a complete idiot now? "Yo, I could totally help out with artsy stuff if you lend me a hand with chem too." The sudden offer was followed by Jiro plopping herself down next to Suyu, bag and notebook in hand. Suyu might have felt annoyed by the intrusion, but her sudden dire need to cover how inadequate she now felt trumped the knee-jerk reaction. In fact, she'd welcome her classmates' presence while she thought of another plan. "Might I join this fortuitous study session?" Tokiyami piped up, approaching the three. It was hard to see unless one looked, but the avian-headed boy was sporting a massive blush due to the embarrassment he felt at needing to ask for help. "And, if I could be so bold, would aid in mathematics be acceptable as well?" "I'd really be grateful." In no time at all, the now group of four were huddled around a pile of books, lost to the world around them as they shared and polished their knowledge with each other. After school, the rest of the day had come and gone without further incidents, besides the slightly odd behavior from Aizawa when he'd eventually returned from his trip to the faculty office. When their classmates had left after the final bell, Detective Tsukauchi had stopped by to pick up Lily for the identification process, which was being held next door. Izuku, Suyu, and Tae were now alone in 1A's classroom, waiting. Two were quiet as they thought over their day, the last busy staring into space. Lily's official welcome to the class had been an interesting mixture of reactions. Most hadn't known how to handle the realization they were interacting with a dead child, and those that did act ran the gamut. Surprisingly enough, it had been Kirishima that had gone as far as to offer up a prayer for the little girl's soul, which had caused Lily to give the redhead a crushing hug. Not one to be outdone, Momo had promised to bring her beauty accessories and tools the next day, the mature girl almost giddy at the idea of dolling up the brunette so she'd look like a real idol. Needless to say, it was a good thing Lily no longer really needed air. Her excitement and joy had been so overpowering she might have passed out from hyperventilation otherwise. The door to the classroom opened and Suyu and Izuku turned, bowing toward the teacher they expected to have entered, Present Mike. Imagine their surprise when upon straightening the two were met with the sight of their principal instead, entering with an extremely skeletal-looking man. Izuku was doubly shocked to realize he recognized the man as the one he'd met at Dagoba. "I told you he'd be here," Nezu quipped to the emaciated man from the doorway, pocketing a yen note said man handed over with a wince. "Principal, sir," Izuku and Suyu exclaimed at the same time, quickly giving a much more formal bow. The quirked animal gave a slight nod and motioned for them to stop. Stepping into the room, the two adults made their way to the students. Present Mike had some rather unexpected business come up, so I offered to oversee this detention, Nezu explained without prompting, seeing the quizzical looks coming from the two green teens. "Although, seeing as I already understand the causes for Asui-san's perceived misbehavior, I'm willing to deviate from a more conventional punishment. That is, if you're interested." The principal's proposition immediately set the two students on edge. Legend of the quirked animal's love of toying with humans had already made the rounds in the freshman classes, and while Izuku was fairly sure they had nothing to fear due to his earlier interactions with Nezu, he wasn't about to risk Suyu's safety for anything. Suyu, likewise, was prepared to accept any punishment over allowing more harm to come to Izuku. What did you have in mind? Izuku asked, inching in front of his friend. Unbidden, Tae covered the trio's rear. Just to be safe. Outwardly raising a furrowed brow, Nezu internally cheered at seeing the protective behavior in front of him. It only encouraged the hope he'd begun to foster in his heart. I'm not much one for corporal punishment, or long lectures on responsibility and consequences, Nezu said, jumping up to sit at Aizawa's desk. These are things I leave to my staff. Instead, I tend toward a more intellectual approach to things. As the quirked animal spoke, the skeletal man pulled out and placed a wooden box on the desk. At a prompt from the principal, Izuku, Suyu, and Tae stepped closer, allowing them to see the ornate designs engraved on the small case. Nezu opened the container, revealing a chessboard with neatly rowed pieces. Each figure appeared to be beautifully handcrafted. You should feel honored at having a chance to play against Nezu-sensei, young Midoriya, the lanky man suddenly spoke up, earning the attention of said teen but unable to garner enough to pull his gaze from the board. Oh, I am, Mr. Izuku trailed off, fumbling when he belatedly realized he couldn't remember the sickly-looking man's name. It completely went over the heads of the two living students that it was Izuku who'd be facing the principal instead of the frog girl who'd actually been in trouble. The man only chuckled, seemingly finding the green-haired teen's question humorous for some reason. Yagi, Toshinori Yagi, the now introduced Yagi said. I work as one of Nezu's secretaries. It was a simple lie, one the blonde had begged the principal to allow so his presence wouldn't further antagonize the teen he'd already hurt so much. Nice to meet you, Yagi-san, Izuku said, bowing again to the man. Suyu quickly followed suit, although Tae remained ramrod straight. If one had looked, they might have seen the zombie girl restraining herself from growling at the blonde. Meanwhile, Nezu had finished setting up the chessboard. The quirked animal clapped his paws together, the soft sound still catching the attention of all present. Now, for the terms, Nezu said, glancing between his two students. Midoriya-san and I will play a single game. Depending on how he fares, Asui-san's punishment will either be reduced to time served observing the match, or... At the trailing of the principal's words, both Izuku and Suyu felt their hearts constrict. Neither knew what madness to expect from their school's infamous principal. She'll have to promise never to do such a thing again. Izuku blinked. Suyu blinked. What? I won't. I promise. The frog girl declared as soon as her brain could fire again, thrown for a loop. Even as the words left her mouth, however, Suyu knew she'd do the exact same thing again if she believed Izuku was in trouble. Nezu laughed lightly at the quick response, Yagi even cracking a smile. Like either of them believed such a thing from what they'd already witnessed of the two. Well, that's good to hear, the principal said, allowing the pledge to go unchallenged. It looks like we can just enjoy the game now, Midoriya-san. Signaling the green-haired teen to take a seat, Nezu looked over his black pieces, eager to see Izuku's opening move. Oh Tae lowly groaned, causing Izuku to chuckle. The easy response indicated to those who didn't speak zombie that nothing important had been communicated. Of course I'm going to lose, I only know the basics of the game, Izuku said, somewhat informing the others of what had been groaned. Even so, I know this will be a good learning experience. With that, the green-haired teen made his first move, earning a smile from the principal and a raised brow from Yagi. Taking a moment, Nezu considered the board, visualizing a handful of possible moves, counter-moves, and contingencies. So, what's your opinion of the current quirk hierarchy, Midoriya-san? Nezu threw out as he moved his first piece. The unexpected, and controversial, question earned surprised stares from Suyu and Yagi both. I think it's stupid, Izuku replied without missing a beat, making his next move. The surprised stares transferred to him. How so? Nezu asked after finishing his second move. A thoughtful expression passed over the green-haired teen. Well, logically speaking, the idea of a hierarchy based on maintaining strong emitter types and evolving stronger bloodlines is ludicrous when considering the randomosity of quirk inheritance, Izuku replied, debating between two pieces for his third move. Take me for example. My parents have emitter-type quirks, but I'm a mutant type. It just happens. Decided, the green-haired teen placed his piece, blocking some of his own while leaving his opponent with two obvious paths of attack. Tsuyu had known that Izuku wasn't a fan of the quirk hierarchy their society clung to, but to hear him openly declare such a position gave her hope for the future. If someone with such a powerful quirk was willing to be so open-minded, it would set an example for others to follow. Yagi was impressed with the boy's reasoning. Of course he'd known of the unofficial, and in some cases, official, practices that constituted the quirk hierarchy, but as the symbol of peace, he'd long ago decided to stay out of that particular fight. He'd worked to build a foundation for society to prosper. Destabilizing it when it had just been so embroiled for so long would have made his job as a hero impossibly harder. At this point, he was sad to say, it was a battle for the next generation to fight. So, you believe what then? Nezu probed, taking a second to lift a piece, consider it, then return it to move another. That the hierarchy should be based on power and utility, instead of type. It was Yagi's turn to blink in confusion. It was well known that the principal usually obliterated challengers in 3 moves. How was the match still going? No, that'd be even worse. Izuku chuckled, sliding a piece forward. The 2 living spectators were now hanging on every word spoken between the 2 opponents. Oh, how so? Nezu threw back, moving an unexpected piece yet still not finishing the battle of wits. Power alone is one of the worst ways to measure someone's worth, Izuku stated firmly. I mean, what good does it do anyone to have all the power in the world if he or she doesn't use it to protect or save the weak? The spoken words cut deeply into Yagi's heart. They were eerily similar to his own master's beliefs on heroes, a philosophy he'd recently realized he'd walked away from after his crippling injury. Tsuyu was mystified at how a simple game of chess had progressed into something entirely more profound. Nezu's eyes widened. That last move, the boy was taunting him. His patience and conviction, it was exciting to see. It made him want to go all out. What would you propose then? Such a question shouldn't have come as a surprise to the green-haired teen based on how the discussion had progressed, but all the same Izuku found himself speechless. He almost missed the principal's move. Well, for starters, actions should speak louder than words, Izuku asserted after recovering. A man's worth should be measured by the benefit his actions bring to society. I mean, a woman's too. I'm including both in that. The green-haired teen's fumbling recovery, and quick glances toward his froggy companion, almost covered his next move. Stop worrying Izuku. Izuku-san. Hero, Tsuyu deadpanned over her near slip of how close the 2 were. I know you intended to be all-inclusive with your words. Truly it was sometimes exasperating all of the silly things the poor boy fretted over. You mentioned society, are you including the whole, or merely the hero aspect? Nezu asked, taking a handful of seconds before making another move. As a whole, I mean, heroes are important, don't get me wrong, but why can't we praise others who are just as important in keeping things together? Izuku answered the question with his own. Why can't we praise the surgeons who battle against death on a daily basis in the hospitals? Why aren't we recognizing the police officers that prevent smaller crimes from plaguing the streets? Even teachers are praiseworthy when they do their jobs. I'm talking about middle school. UA's been great as far as teachers go so far. Beginning to fret again, Izuku finished moving his piece. While Nezu contemplated his own move, Tsuyu was forced to break the green-haired teen out of a mumble storm. At this point, Yagi was nearing the end of his rope. He couldn't believe what he was seeing. This was the first time he'd witnessed anyone stand their ground for so long against the principal, even if he was going easy on the kid. 30 minutes later, Nezu and Yagi waved their goodbyes to the retreating forms of 2 teens and 2 zombies, 3 of which appeared to be excitedly discussing what would happen during classes tomorrow. The 2 adults, however, were at the moment more interested in discussing what had just happened in the classroom. 15 moves, Sensei, I can't believe you were held off for so long. Yagi was the first to address his thoughts. He well knew how fired up the quirked animal could get, and how brutal he was when he let loose. You held back for an awfully long time. That's the thing, I didn't. Nezu replied, chuckling. Truthfully, I haven't had that much fun in ages. I'm actually looking forward to a next time. The longing suffused into the principal's voice caused Yagi to shudder, only for a fresh shiver of fear to shoot down his spine when he processed what the quirked animal had just said. He hadn't been holding back. Toshinori Yagi, at that moment, freely admitted that he was intimidated by the thought of having to teach such a gifted mind. So, what do you think about the kid and his quirk? Yagi asked, hoping to glean some advice from the genius beside him. The skeletal man hoped the principal would give him something he could use to make amends for his past failures with the boy. I think that tomorrow will prove to be most interesting, Nezu replied, considering every piece of information his high-functioning intellect had available. Will Midoriya prove he can command his tools handedly in rescue operations? Will he bend to the pressure and end up commanding other students as well, or instead? I can hardly wait to find out. Yagi quieted, contemplating what awaited him. He needed to make a good impression this time. He needed to set an example for all of his students. At the USJ, it was into a rather plain office that Mitsuki Bakugo and her son Katsuki walked, quite a bit earlier than needed. The two were clad in the best formal clothes they could find in their closets, the mother well aware of the impact presentation might make on the inauspicious day. The rest of their lives could very well be at stake here, and they needed every advantage they could scrounge up if they wanted even a hope of walking free. Too bad only one of the two truly meant their repentance. Mrs. Bakugo, on behalf of UA Academy, allow me to present the demands and conditions for your son to avoid criminal charges, immediately spoke a tall, sharp-featured man with stylish hair as the two entered. Words dropped from his tongue like that of the consummate charmer, his easygoing demeanor disarming. His identification card read, Sakamoto. Mind you, these are only on behalf of the school. Next to the obviously long-retained lawyer, who stood behind the single desk that was present, an imposing woman exuding an air of 1,000 victories stepped forward, taking the man's left side. Her violet locks were crowned in an austere bun except for two bangs that framed her stern face, and the power suit she wore was impeccable. Her identification card reading, Kamishiro, was clipped to her chest. On behalf of the Asui family, it is my duty and honor to ensure my clients be assured their lives will no longer be placed in jeopardy at the hands of a poorly raised brat with delusions of grandeur, the woman proclaimed, staring dispassionately at the Bakugos. Katsuki shifted where he stood, glaring at the bitch that dared to badmouth him. He wondered why his mother wasn't unleashing her usual temper on these extras already. On the opposite side of Sakamoto stood another woman, this one wearing glasses, a tan blazer with a white skirt, and a clearly angry visage. On behalf of the Iida family, I will guarantee that no evil here goes unpunished, the second woman declared, taking a seat along with the other attorneys. Hange was stamped on her identification card. Mitsuki swallowed hard, already sweating buckets under such blistering glares. Everything from this point on depended on her son sticking to the plan, and whatever mercy could be found at the hands of the intimidating lawyers the Asui and Iida families had delivered them to. The ride to the USJ. The remaining students of Class 1A, plus zombies, were currently bundled on a bus on their way to being tested on the most important role of being a hero, saving lives. Many were excited at such a prospect, others were nervous, others still were distracted. And, this is powder for your nose, Momo explained as she pointed to an open compartment in the ridiculously large makeup case sitting next to her. With an angelic laugh, Lily clapped in delight from the mature girl's lap. It's incredible, the little zombie cried, a smile so pure it blinded half the students stretching across her face. It's prettier than the professional sets Lily saw backstage. With the bus designed so that its seats were against the windows, the need to have students cramped into pairs had been eliminated. Momo was thankful Izuku's observational skills had allowed him to notice this fact before anyone had wasted time choosing partners, though it hadn't stopped Iida from trying. Her being able to more easily spoil Lily was a nice perk too. Man, is it still weird to anyone that we're sharing our education with two zombies now? Hiroshima asked no one in particular. I can't decide if Midoriya's more manly for having them around or not. The redhead's words may have seemed questioning, but his ruby eyes were undeniably sad. It was obvious the teen wished they could give the little girl final rest. In his opinion, of the two zombies she unequivocally deserved a proper send-off to the afterlife. It's wrong, Ojiro grumbled, hearing Kirishima's words and deciding to throw in his own 2 yen. The tailed boy's frown spoke of pure animosity and rejection. Perturbed, the spiky redhead leaned away from his classmate. Dude, what's your problem? Kirishima asked. Ojiro merely crossed his arms in judgment. True heroes do their own work, the tailed boy stated, nodding to himself. They don't stoop to using others. Unable to keep himself from eavesdropping, Tokiyami clenched his fist as he reined in his anger. A lecture was the least of what he wanted to give his peer. Ojiro hadn't only just insulted his friend, but he'd also offended the raven-headed boy himself. Dark Shadow, the eldritch entity that lived inside of him thanks to his quirk, was much the same to him as Tae and Lily were to Izuku. He'd long ago come to terms with and befriended the sentient creature in order to become a hero, it standing as his strength, and it was beyond rude for someone to openly denounce that kind of partnership as something foul out of turn. Don't. Izuku's soft warning was accompanied by a warm hand resting on Tokiyami's shoulder. It's not worth it. Turning, the raven-headed teen saw his friend looking back at him with an earnest smile and clear eyes. Beside the green-haired teen, Asui, Su, sat nose deep in a notebook that looked exactly like the one in his own hands. Of course, Tokiyami replied just as softly, reopening his notebook. I do indeed possess something much worthier of occupying my time with. Looking down, the raven-haired teen, and even Dark Shadow after a minute, once again became absorbed in the pages of his notebook. Curiosity had led him into asking Suyu what had her so engrossed when they'd first set off for the testing site, and surprise had greeted him when he'd been informed it was a quirk analysis authored by their mutual green-haired friend. It had made immediate sense to him that Izuku would pay that kind of attention to his princess, admit it or not, but then his friend had given him one as well. Opening the innocent-looking book had revealed page after page of incredibly accurate and extensive details about his own quirk. Further examination had shown that there were sections dedicated to everything from gear that could theoretically boost his performance to tactics that would give him an edge in battle. One particular entry postulated the idea of Dark Shadow forming a sort of armor around his body. That one caught both of their attentions. In the rear of the bus, Mina and Toru sat together, quietly talking amongst themselves. The pink-skinned girl was just shy of fuming. Every time she tried to have a little fun or lighten up the mood, a little something came along and sabotaged her. With her last hope for a proper romance to gossip about failing to bear fruit, for the moment, she felt it was high time she pranked someone. And she knew just the target. Min-chan, maybe we should lay low for today, Toru pleaded, dressed in her hero costume like everyone else, that is to say, gloves and a pair of boots. Besides, there's no ammunition to use. They're all clean. The pink-haired girl considered her friend's words, finding her other classmates extremely boring today. Why couldn't everyone act more like Kiri used to, and provide her never-ending entertainment? Yeah, maybe you're right, Mina conceded, before noticing Toru's words were a little too accurate. They really do look clean, too clean. Back at the front of the bus, Izuku and Suyu were decked in their repaired suits, which looked better than new. But what had caught the Pinket's attention wasn't the sudden increased quality of her classmates' costumes, or the addition of strange-looking guns on the Verdunette's person. No, what drew her eye was that Tae and Lily appeared exceptionally hygienic. And seeing undead so spiffed was unnatural, wasn't it? Mina quietly admitted to herself that perhaps Lily had been allowed to use a shower, but that didn't account for the appearance of the less mentally present Tae now, did it? I can't believe she finished your weapons in only 4 days, Hiro, Suyu admitted, expressing her surprise at the artillery before her when she could finally break away from her notebook. Izuku nodded in agreement, pulling out and examining one of his new pieces from its shoulder holster. Hatsume had been able to complete 3 models ahead of time, a blocky pistol, a sturdy-looking SMG, and a menacing pump-action shotgun. The simplest had been for Izuku, who hadn't wanted to deal with unwieldy weaponry so early in his career. Lily had been given the SMG, her small size perfect for agile movements and rapid-fire attacks. That left Tae with the shotgun, a decision the green-haired teen was still a little unsure of. I'm just as surprised, Izuku agreed, happy to finally see some of his imagined gadgets come to life. These would be the tools that would become fundamental in his future as a pro. They're just prototypes though. I need to do some testing first. Hey Midoriya. Mina's shout overrode whatever the green-haired teen was going to say. The Pinket's overly giddy expression didn't sit well with the resident necromancer, or frog girl. In perfect sync, Izuku and Tsuyu turned to look at Mina, earning both an even more pronounced grin. You know, I've been noticing that Tae-chan's always looking clean and healthy, the Pinket began, attempting to draw her target in. The confused stares from the green duo let her know she'd made an easy catch. Is it difficult for you to wash her during bath time? Izuku sputtered, nearly dropping his new pistol. Holstering the gun, the green-haired boy felt almost every pair of eyes on the bus land on him. Even Tsuyu's, especially Tsuyu's. I do the best I can, Izuku fumbled, trying to avoid explicit details. My mother helps the most though, to make sure she feels clean. The green-haired teen was sure that most of his classmates didn't buy his hasty explanation, but at the very least it appeared nobody seemed to want to press the issue. So, you've seen her. Them, naked. Mineta was that nobody apparently, quickly jumping to the worst conclusions. You've been with both of them, naked, in the bathroom. At this point, Mina and Toru had accomplished their mission, and were covertly covering their mouths and stomachs in a vain attempt to contain their uncontrollable giggling. Others weren't so delighted, and had turned green at the implications. Oi, stop that you perv, Jiro almost shouted. The punk rock girl could admit to herself that she'd been curious about the topic at one point, but digging into it in public was in extremely bad taste. Mineta, unable to contain himself any longer, jumped up onto his seat, still not even standing eye level with the green-haired teen. This is so unfair, Midoriya. The pervy midget shouted, flailing his arms for added effect. We can't even land a touch on a girl, and yet you can just grab these two by the poo. Bang! Quick as lightning, Izuku drew his pistol, took aim, and fired, shooting the midget right in the chin. The piece of tech worked exactly as intended, releasing a realistic sound effect for maximized intimidation factor but including almost no recoil. The bus was deafening in its silence. The members of 1A that had been observing the spectacle were beyond speechless. Their vice president had just shot a classmate. Heroes in training they might have been, but none had any idea of how to react to the situation. On one hand it was a no-brainer that shooting someone probably wasn't the right answer, on the other hand, Mineta. Mineta had recoiled from the impact of the shot, which had struck with almost the equivalent force of a strong beeper punch, but it was the quickly expanding foam that had caused him to attempt to cry for help. Unfortunately, or fortunately depending on how you felt about the midget, the bubbling concoction quickly covered his mouth before solidifying a moment later. If the diminutive pervert wanted to speak again he'd need outside assistance, or make peace with ripping off his lips. Gah! Tae groaned, snapping the busload of students from their shock. You're right, Hatsume really did make them exactly as requested, Izuku replied, clicking the safety switch on his pistol, keen to prevent a misfire of his weapon. In a move that obviously still needed work, the green-haired teen flicked the gun into a spin around his index finger before holstering it. Maybe I should let her make all our gear. It'd be a great partnership. Tsuyu's resultant croaking closely resembled a rebuke, and coupled with her poking of Izuku's cheek in clear disapproval sent many of their classmates into fits of humor. Meanwhile, at the front of the bus, Aizawa chose to ignore the shenanigans of his students for the moment, unable to shake the suspicion that something wasn't right. It doesn't bode well that we still have no idea who did it, Aizawa thought, mulling over the morning's incident once again. Or, more importantly, what purpose it served. Earlier in the day, before he'd even had a chance to roll out of bed, the gruff pro-hero had been informed by a call from UA secretaries that the school's perimeter had been breached at some point during the night. The feat itself was less impressive than the fact that the gaping hole left in the defensive wall had been made without any indicative noise. If it hadn't been for the original alarms sounding from the barriers first being initiated, the break-in might never have been discovered until an arriving student had noticed it. As it was, after a hasty search of the grounds and the school from top to bottom, nothing had been turned up. That alone put the entire staff even more on their guard. In more than one hero's opinion, finding no clues at all was more suspicious and worrisome than if they'd uncovered traces of someone. We should have postponed this, Aizawa reflected. I don't like this. Unfortunately, it wasn't like he could turn the bus around now. 10 minutes later, entrance of the USJ. Entering through the reinforced doors of the massive domed facility, Aizawa and his 19 students, plus 2 zombies, were greeted by a truly breathtaking sight. From the massive walkway they stood on that dropped away via stairs, a multitude of catastrophes could be seen. In the distance an artificial lake glistened, a 6-tiered spiral flume releasing water near a small yacht that appeared shipwrecked. Across from the lake rose a miniature mountain range, deep crevices clear to see even from this distance. Next door to the mountains rested a huge crumbling mound of earth where half-submerged structures bespoke of a devastating landslide. Opposing glass domes, one decorated in flames while the other in storm clouds, squatted to the group's right and next to the lake. Lastly, a small-scale city taken right out of a post-apocalyptic movie stood to their left. Connecting all of these zones was a beautiful plaza with a fountain that was a perfect place to use as a hub and rest area. All told, it was a perfect place for training any quirk imaginable. Everyone, I've been waiting for you, greeted a seemingly living space suit. Welcome. Before the students of 1A could think quickly enough to recognize the famous hero, a certain nerd blurted out the knowledge. It's the Space Hero 13. Izuku gushed, introducing the beloved figure. As a rescue hero, they've saved tons of people from all kinds of disasters. The green-haired teen's sharing of information was well received by both his fellow students and the advising hero, who always appreciated being recognized. Aizawa, standing to the side, glanced around in thought. Something wasn't right, again. 13, where's All Might? The gruff teacher asked, moving closer to his coworker. If something had happened, he didn't want to worry his students when finding out. He was supposed to meet us here. To Class 1A, what followed their homeroom teacher's enquiry was a hushed conversation in a secret language spoken alongside a game of charades, 13 mysteriously holding up 3 fingers while whispering. Wondering if he should be worried, the resident necromancer looked around with a frown. The green-haired teen was unable to discern what the 2 pro-heroes were discussing, but if Aizawa-sensei's body language was anything to go by, then it wouldn't hurt to be on high alert. Beside him, Tae slipped into a tenser stance, not helping Izuku's nerves one bit. Lily, in contrast, merely grabbed onto his pants leg nervously. I see, he was just delayed. Aizawa's grousing suddenly garnered the attention of his students. Well, it can't be helped. Let's get started. A quick bow from the space-themed hero and Class 1A was handed over to their rescue instructor. Now then, 13 began. Who can tell me the best way to tell a combat quirk from a support quirk? After tricking the class with that opening question, since they revealed it was how a quirk was used that decided its classification from a professional hero-ing standpoint, the rescue hero launched into their speech. Attentive so as to not be thrown off again, the students ended up being exceedingly receptive to the lecture. They learned, if they hadn't already considered the fact, that quirks could be either tremendously beneficial or extremely detrimental to society based on users' concern for the safety of those around them. Izuku personally loved the part where 13 reiterated that quirks that were considered dangerous or dark shouldn't be judged villainous out of turn unless they were used with the intention to kill. With a flourish, the rescue hero ended their discourse and bowed, earning cheers from 1A. As a whole, the group felt further energized to learn rescue procedures. And then the electricity flickered, and died. Aizawa was the first to feel it, an overwhelming presence oozing malice, coming from the center of the plaza down below. He was too slow to stop Izuku, however, who walked over to the stairs to look out toward the fountain. The pro-hero had no way of knowing his problem child had his own sensitivity to such anomaly. Unaware of his teacher's alarm, the green-haired teen's blood was making his veins tingle all over, and not in a good way. Tae's low growl and Lily's soft whimpers only amplified his growing fears. Sensei, tell me this is a drill, Izuku whispered, pinched voice denoting the anxiety he was feeling at the moment. Now standing beside him, Aizawa shook his head. I can't, the gruff teacher denied. The man's mind raced faster and faster, vainly attempting to conceive of the best way to keep his students safe from a threat he couldn't even see yet. "Everyone, gather together and don't move." As Aizawa bellowed his orders, a massive hole in reality twisted into existence down in the plaza. In a split second, the shadowy tear ripped open, exploding outward to cover the entire fountain area in a massive dark cloud of mist. From the writhing darkness, figures began to emerge, too many to count. From their distance, facial expressions were hard to denote, but the common demeanor they carried made it clear they weren't friendly at all. Izuku, analytical mind whirring into gear, noticed immediately that a large portion of the mist-walking invaders were mutants, or at least held dominant mutant genes that colored their physical traits. Even with such little information to go on, the green-haired teen felt his stomach drop at the sight. It was a sad reality, but the Quirk hierarchy the world lived by didn't take kindly to those who appeared less than human, growing more discriminatory the more bizarre the appearance. He might have sounded like a hypocrite, but in that moment, Izuku knew beyond a doubt these were villains. "Whoa, this is just like the entrance exam," Hiroshima exclaimed, stepping closer to the edge of the stairway. "Did our scenarios begin already?" "Stay back," Izuku barked, throwing an arm out to balk the crimson-haired teen. "We need to obey Aizawa-sensei." Below the two pro-heroes and heroes in training, the expanding dark mist paused before receding into a humanoid shape, if humans had black fire with yellow eyes for heads. The mist man looked up, gazing intently at the observers above. Unsure if it would work, Izuku put his entire focus into his hearing. "Teen and Eraserhead," the green-haired teen managed to hear, schedule said, would, today. The words were disconcerting, but Aizawa's response was even worse. "Damn, so these are the bastards behind the infiltration." "Infiltration? Where?" Izuku's mind shuddered to think what they were going to do if these were villains powerful enough to break into one of Japan's premier hero academies and get away with it. Aizawa clenched his fists and grit his teeth in frustration. This was a disaster. There were enough scumbags down there to give him problems even if he had 13's help, and as it was he couldn't allow the rescue hero to leave his students unattended. That meant he'd be doing this solo. Instantly accepting the reality of the situation, the normally gruff pro-hero pulled up his goggles, covering his eyes completely. So be it. Izuku didn't know what to do, but he knew there was no way he or his classmates were ready for this. A life-and-death situation was so far above a combat drill it wasn't funny, and even from this distance the green-haired teen could feel the bloodlust rolling off so many of the villains. Some signal, unseen and unheard, must have sounded because as the mob of invaders advanced, Izuku seeing only 3 hold back by the fountain. Of the 3, even with the dark mist man present, it was a lanky man with silver hair that projected the most maleficence, even more so than the massive man-beast with its brain exposed. This probably had to do with the fact that the silver-haired man was covered head to toe in dismembered hands. Izuku hoped those were just props to intimidate them, because it was working. "Sensei, those 3 in the back are probably the leaders," the green-haired teen informed, unable to leave such information to chance even though a pro-hero such as Eraserhead no doubt already noticed such a thing. "I know," Aizawa said curtly, bending his knees slightly in preparation of launching himself forward. Izuku, seeing his teacher preparing to preemptively strike their enemies, couldn't hold back what was haunting his thoughts. "Sensei, they're organized," the green-haired teen whispered, pressing through his bone-shaking terror. "That means they probably have a plan." Of course the villains had a plan. Going so far as to infiltrate such a prestigious school as UA, and then to dare attack students on top of that. Normal villains wouldn't be brave enough to even consider such a thing unless there was a solid strategy planned. "I know," Aizawa repeated, this time turning halfway to consider his problem child. "Stay with your classmates. Keep them together." Without giving any further orders, Aizawa hurled himself forward, bounding down the stairs in an effort to prevent the mob of villains from getting any closer to his students. Without waiting for any further orders, Izuku headed back to his classmates, walking into a group of students who were beginning to panic as the weight of their current crisis settled on their shoulders. "Sensei, shouldn't the facility's alarms be sounding?" Momo asked 13 as Izuku melded into the ranks of 1A. "What's happened to the sensors?" The space-themed hero was concentrating on a device on their wrist, pressing buttons over and over again with no response. They should be responding, 13 said, seemingly confused as to why their tech wasn't working properly. Todoroki stepped forward, face as emotionless as it had ever been. The dual-haired teen was by this time recognized by many in 1A as their strongest member. Those same students felt the heterochromatic's quirk was a nice reassurance to have around. The more important question, Todoroki paused, making sure everyone was paying attention, as did they only appear here, or all around campus. The idea that this was a widespread incursion boggled the minds of many. No one had been gutsy enough to launch a full-scale war against UA since the early days of the hero profession, when the academy had first been established. Unfortunately, all we know right now is that they've attacked here, a place isolated from the main campus, Todoroki continued, glaring disdainfully at the mob of villains. And what's worse, they chose a time when a class was meant to be present. This was planned, it must be. Izuku, seeing the hush that followed the grim assertion as his only window to speak, stepped up next to the heterochromatic. We need to evacuate. Now, the green-haired teen declared. With 13 in the lead, we should be able to make it. If he'd had the time, Izuku would have appreciated the expressions many of his classmates were giving him. In these moments of stress and danger, almost all eyes looked to him with hints of the faith that comes from understanding someone's stepped up to take charge. Someone's working to get through the adversity. But he didn't have the time, because he'd stepped up, and was working. If the villains are inhibiting the sensors, communications might be jammed as well, Izuku continued, turning to the classmate who could check this for him. Kaminari, see if your headset can reach outside. If it can, call for help. Utterly flabbergasted, the electric blonde stared at the green-haired teen even as he raised a hand to the device on his ear. How did you? Kaminari stopped himself, recognizing they were all in too dire a situation to waste time asking questions right now. In seconds, the teen had checked every channel his gadget could scan. He shook his head in disbelief. It's all jammed. But, Aizawa-sensei, Momo trailed off, quick to begin worrying about their homeroom teacher. As if calling his name was a magnet, 1A turned as a whole to watch the combat that had just started down below. Breaking from their pack, 3 villains had rushed forward to form an interception against the gruff teacher. Each of the thugs were mutated in some way that allowed different body parts to act as long-distance weapons, most likely why they'd gone ahead. The trio took aim, then looked at each other confused as their quirks failed them and nothing happened. In the blink of an eye, Aizawa was on them, immediately wrapping the largest one with his special scarf. Twisting, the pro-hero swung his captive into his compatriots, knocking all 3 of their head together and rendering them unconscious. Witnessing their homeroom teacher able to hold his own, the students of 1A felt less opposed toward the idea of evacuating. Making the most of the time they had, the teens turned and made their way toward the entrance of the massive facility. With each step, Izuku grew more despondent. The hero nerd in him knew that for all his strengths, Eraserhead was not a hero meant to combat villains en masse for long. 7 minutes to reach the bus, 3 to get it moving, say 5 to clear the premises. Izuku's mind continued to work in overdrive even as he and his class escaped. And that's assuming whatever's jamming us can't reach farther than the USJ. The green-haired teen quickly came to the conclusion that no matter what they did, Aizawa wouldn't have enough time. Even in a best-case scenario, the pro-hero would be overcome by sheer numbers before help could arrive, meaning that for him to survive the gruff teacher needed assistance now. Putting all of his brainpower into formulating a plan that allowed for entirely green students to actually help a pro, Izuku was unprepared when their situation went from bad to worse. I'm afraid I can't allow you all to just leave, came a voice that Izuku recognized as the mist man's from down by the fountain. Reality warped once more, and where before there'd been a clear path to the exit now arrived a dark violet portal of fog. The green-haired teen watched as the mist man stepped from the blackness he'd created, his mind instantly cataloging the villain's quirk as a teleportation type. That explained how the invaders had gotten inside the USJ so easily. A pleasure to meet all of you, the mist man said, grandly bowing to the group. May we introduce ourselves? You see, we are known as the League of Villains. The villain's smugness bled through any faux gentlemanliness he'd been attempting to convey. The space hero and the students were trapped. With the mob behind them and a warp user in front, they'd been left without any options for an escape route. I know it may seem a bit presumptuous of us, but we've invited ourselves here, to this place, this garden of heroes, this renowned academy known as UA for one purpose, the Mist Man continued, acting as if he were a ringleader presenting a stage show with how he waved his arms about. Izuku took notice of two things as the villain spoke. The first was that he loved to monologue and was something of a showboat. The second and more important detail was that for barely a second he thought he'd seen some sort of neck brace hidden in the shadowy mist, almost like some sort of heavy-duty respirator. "We've come to find the number one hero," the Mist Man revealed. "We've come to ensure All Might takes his last breath this day." Not a single student was able to withhold a gasp at that declaration. Izuku knew such a plan was normally ludicrous to even consider. All Might never lost, but just the same he knew that this only put him and his classmates in even greater danger. Villains, especially organized groups like this one, never played fair, and the green-haired team could already imagine dozens of scenarios that might have a feasible chance at success against the symbol of peace. These nightmares included the villains recruiting someone with a hypersensitive quirk capable of countering the number one hero's indomitable strength to the students being held hostage in order to force All Might into a protracted fight surrounded by lethally toxic fumes. Now, I believe All Might was to be present for these exercises. The villain's tone was thick with the conceit of a victorious foe. Was there perhaps a change in the day's schedule? The Mist Man began to expand before any answer could be given, losing his humanoid shape to become a malevolent wall of darkness. Then, the wall began to move toward them. "It honestly doesn't matter, I suppose," the villain added, not noticing 13 slowly repositioning themselves. "My job here is the same. Nothing's changed." Izuku knew he needed to help. Leaving things to chance was the worst option. Calmly, the green-haired teen moved Lily behind him while discreetly signaling Tae to inch sideways so she'd be able to react better. The plan would be haphazard, but simple. If things went as he theorized, 13 was about to attempt to use his quirk, Black Hole, on the villain. The villain would of course try to evade, but if he could get himself in just the right placement, he'd be able to use his new pistol to aim for that single piece of gear he'd seen in the mist. Izuku had no guarantee if his expanding foam bullets would work on someone whose natural state of being was so ethereal, but the flash and bang of his attack might distract the villain long enough for 13 to finish the job. If that failed, however, Tae would still be able to take a pot shot with her shotgun, the force of the firearm alone likely to ensure the success of the maneuver. The green-haired teen palmed his weapon, slowly popping off the small leather strap that kept it from falling out by accident, just as the space-themed hero pointed their index finger at the villain. Izuku calmed his heart as much as he could. He needed to boost his meager ability as much as possible. There it was. 13 stepped forward, popping open a finger valve on their glove. Izuku inched sideways, slowly drawing his pistol. He took aim. "Don't underestimate us, you scum. Like hell we're going to just stand here. We're heroes too." And his plan went to shit as Ojiro, closely followed by Kirishima, leapt into the air toward the villain. The two shouted war cries as they engaged the Mist Man in CQC, or tried to anyway. Both teens passed through the villain without so much as tickling him, only succeeding in getting in the way of the pro-hero trying to save their lives. Izuku cursed. The villain was going to be more prepared for any attacks now. The fight had just become even more difficult. Tae's low groan and dark glare directed at the tailed martial artist mirrored the roiling emotions running through the green-haired teen. "Of course," the Mist Man said with disdain, "even as only students, you're all still fine golden eggs." The villain's acidic yellow eyes moved through the black mist until they could glare at the two interloping students. Ojiro and Kirishima froze, the bloodlust directed at them too much to handle as inexperienced as they were. "You two, get out of the way!" 13 screamed, their voice modulator straining due to the pro-hero's distress. It was too little, too late. "Disperse and despair," the villain commanded, his dark mist appearing to draw inward. "While you suffer a most tortuous death." The Mist Man exploded. It was akin to a pressure valve bursting really. Rolling waves of darkness enveloped the entire class in a rushing wave, blinding them all for a few precious moments. Izuku could still hear though. He heard Suyu's croak of fear so clearly it hurt. Instinctively he reached for her, only to be tackled to the side. Shaking a near concussion from his head, the green-haired teen opened his eyes, realizing it was Iida who had pulled him, and Uraraka it appeared, out of the villain's range. Frantically looking back, Izuku felt his heart stop. His most important people were still inside a now swirling dome of impenetrable shadowy mist. Su-chan, Lily-chan, Tae-chan. Izuku screamed in horror, scrambling to reach the dome. He had to save them. He couldn't let them die. A strong hand snatched one of the green-haired teen's flailing arms out of the air, reeling him back with a sharp jerk. Midoriya, calm down. It was Iida, again. The bespectacled teen shook Izuku, trying to reach the vice president through his anguish. Now's not the time to lose focus over your zombies. Before Iida could suggest the thrashing green-haired teen use his control over the zombie girls to keep their classmates safe within the dark prison that held them, which may or may not have worked given the circumstances, the dome dispersed. All that was left was 13 and a near-feral Tae, growling. GGRRRRR, the zombie snarled in the direction of the villain, who was slowly reforming. For one who never spoke, it was clear to see the attempt at separating her from Izuku had upset the undead girl. 13 hesitantly patted themselves down, checking to see if everything was still attached. They'd only managed to evade the mass warping thanks to the zombie's quick action. As the wave of dark mist had approached, she'd grabbed their arm, then used her free hand as an anchor, by punching through the ground. The pro-hero made a mental note to demand additional safeguards regarding the undead Midoriya used. Based on the strength he'd just seen, their bite would be more than deadly. Su-chan, Izuku whispered in a broken voice. His 1,000-yard stare locked on the space the frog girl had occupied not a second ago. Lily-chan. The green-haired teen was drowning in guilt and self-hatred. He'd failed. Again, he'd failed to uphold his promise to the cute little girl who'd suffered so much. He'd failed to protect the girl that had been meaning more and more to him every day. His mind was overclocking, twisting the fate of the two girls into mental horrors of unknown battlefields, or just straight-up death. The villain's quirk was largely unknown. Its capabilities could have been endless for all he knew. Midoriya, Iida called again, anxiously looking from his vice president to the zombie he controlled. Each passing second the undead girl appeared to be slipping into a more berserker-like state. Please, get a hold of yourself. Izuku-kun, Ochako cried, trying and failing to break the teen from his trance. Tae was now hunched over, fists clenching and unclenching. Iida and Ochako weren't sure which to be more wary of at that moment, the zombie or the villain. GHA. Izuku's head snapped up so hard at the ferocious grunt from the undead girl his blood was forced to heal minute hairline fractures along his atlanto-axis joint. Still, alive. The words, he didn't know how he knew, but the green-haired teen's gut sang that they were true. There was hope. Izuku needed a plan. He needed to act. Lily and Suyu might have still been living now, but there was no way to tell for how long that would hold true. There was just one major problem. His body wouldn't move. Fear and hopelessness had left him paralyzed. I'm powerless by myself. What can I do? Izuku thought, watching wide-eyed as the villain finished reforming. He'd been right. It turned out, the Mist Man was wearing an apparatus around his neck. It was literally the only piece of him that was solid. Neurons fired, thoughts raced even faster, and Izuku felt, deep inside of himself, something shift. He wants to kill them, my dear ones. His fear caught fire and burned to ash, and in its place rose an insatiable anger. Hate. He needs to be neutralized. Izuku could feel his thoughts being molded by this newborn wrath. Kill. My body needs to move. Izuku's will drank from the fount of his rage, beginning to subconsciously tap into his blood. It felt as if it was boiling. Obey. And then he could stand. Outwardly, the green-haired teen appeared calm and collected, which slightly eased the worry his two classmates had been feeling. But they were behind him. For 13 and the villain, who were positioned to see his front, they saw a silhouetted form, the lenses of a pair of sunglasses giving the figure two round, glowing red eyes. Both adults assumed that it was a trick of the lighting, affected by the power outage caused by the invaders. They were wrong. Behind his sunglasses, Izuku's eyes burned red. "Iida, you're the fastest," the green-haired teen's words, while true, felt wrong. "I need you to get out, get to campus, and get help." Iida blinked, unprepared for such a cowardly plan, or for him to be the one to have to carry it out. "Midoriya," the bespectacled teen protested, "even if I wanted to. We're going to give you an opening." Izuku cut him off, "and you're going to get out, get to campus, and get help." It wasn't conversation. It wasn't a request. It was an order. And it would be followed. "Listen to your vice president." 13 weighed in, agreeing with the plan. "He knows your quirk is the only hope to save your classmates." Actually, Izuku just wanted to be rid of the one who could, would, and already had physically stopped him already. He was going to neutralize the villain, and nobody was getting in his way. But he wasn't going to voice that, of course. "Chie." Izuku didn't bother lowering his voice, the mist man had already been observing him. The zombie girl tensed, completely prepared for any order. "Run to the gate and open it for Iida." There was no hesitation or delay in carrying out the command, much to the surprise of the villain. The girl darted toward the entrance immediately, no sign of concern toward facing his quirk or for her own safety. "I won't let you," the mist man shouted while throwing his arms out, the limbs extending into shadowy claws, only to feel a sudden, undeniable pull ripping him away. "You have no choice," 13 yelled as they used Black Hole to absorb the villain's mist and pull him away. Seeing his chance, Iida shot off after the zombie. Chie reached the gates mere seconds later, Iida catching up to her just as she plunged her crowbar between the metal barriers. In a short amount of time that would have otherwise been concerning, the undead girl had pried the two halves of the gate open, her strength more than a match for the hydraulics system. Holding the metal slabs apart, the tall boy dashed through. Her task complete, Chie pulled her crowbar back, allowing the gate to slam shut. No villains could be allowed an opportunity to chase Iida down. No, the mist man howled in obvious distress as he watched the tall boy escape. "Damn you!" The villain turned to glare at the pro-hero, his acidic eyes now truly cold. "So you believe your powerful quirk can save you, do you?" Well, distracting 13 with his words, the mist man subtly opened a portal behind the pro-hero. Which was exactly what Izuku had been waiting for. His analytical mind had run this exact scenario earlier, which was why he'd already been in motion heading toward 13 the moment Iida took off running. Launching himself airborne, the green-haired teen dropkicked the space-themed hero out of the way the instant before the ambush portal could finish turning them into a victim of their own quirk. 13's HUD flashed and blinked in alarm, their suit's sensors disintegrated. A sharp pain shot along their back before a much more blunt form of aggression threw them out of the way. Straining against throbbing aches and shooting agony, the pro-hero managed to shift enough after crashing to the ground to see it had been their green-haired student who's assaulted them. Then they noticed the portal that had formed behind where they'd been standing, and realization sparked that they'd just been saved from causing their own demise. How shameful. Izuku couldn't complete his risky maneuver without a price, however. Black Hole's gravitational pull, directed through the portal, caught his right foot halfway through his follow-through. Before either quirk was disengaged, the force of nature devoured his shoe, and then his whole foot. Still in motion, and doing his best to ignore the mind-numbing pain, the green-haired teen willed with all his might for his body to take aim and fire at the villain's neck brace. Thankfully, his body obeyed. 2 consecutive shots rang out, successfully slamming into the respirator. Bang, bang, the mist man yelped, rearing back as the unexpected feel of actual pain caused him to flinch. Izuku slammed to the ground hard, back first. Pushing the agony of his injuries aside one more time, he took a few precious seconds to re-aim before firing twice more. Bang, bang, in a move more instinctual than skill, the villain used his mist to warp the bullets away before contact. But it was already too late. "Wah, what in the hell is this?" The once suave voice rose as alarm turned to horror, the 2 landed shots beginning to work their magic. The bullets expanded, their foam swallowing more and more of the respirator. Terrified, the mist man moved to portal away. When Tae came crashing into him with her crowbar, swinging at the neck brace like she was trying out for the major leagues. The bar of wrought metal smashed into the device with all the power undead muscles could muster, nearly shattering the apparatus. Collapsing to the ground, the mist man choked on cries of pain and panic. Victory won. Izuku forced himself upright, hobbling to stand over his fallen foe. But he didn't think to celebrate. This was far from over. He still had to find his dear friends and make sure they got out of this alive. Then, he was going to put an end to these villains. Oh no, this was just the beginning. To be continued. I hope you enjoyed this story. Also remember to subscribe and like this video. See you in the next video.